in person, but we are working towards a reopening plan of our council and we'll be prepared to announce the date at a future meeting. We're watching the Delta variant carefully and trying to make sure that we are prudent in determining when we can actually start to meet in person again. We're doing that to protect you and your families, and we recognize the need for social distancing. There's several ways in which you can participate in our meetings, and we encourage you to do so. You may watch the meetings live on Comcast Channel 21 or Frontier Channel 29. They are also available online at www.everettwa.gov/citycouncil, where you may also watch past meetings. You may call in to listen to the live meeting at any point by dialing 425-616-3920, conference ID 724-887-726#. Members of the public are always welcome to provide comments or concerns on any matter via email at council@everettwa.gov. We also welcome our community wishing to participate by phone during council meetings to obtain the weekly conference ID by contacting the council office at 425-257-8703 or by email at council@everettwa.gov, by visiting the city council page of the city website, or it is published on the weekly meeting agenda in the local newspaper. We ask that those wishing to comment be respectful and limit your remarks to 3 minutes. Please note that we do not allow comments on any kind of campaigning, whether for or against ballot measures or candidates running for office. We also do not accept comments focused on personal matters that are unrelated to city business. If you have any comments or suggestions on our processes, please contact the council offices at 425-257-8703. As these meetings are remote, I'd like to remind anyone participating in public comments, please mute your microphone by pressing *6 until you're called upon. Our process will run very similar to a regular meeting. After each council agenda item, I will call down the list of council members, giving all members an opportunity to comment or ask questions. And council members will need to identify themselves when moving an action or when unsolicited comment is provided. These extra communication steps will ensure the community and our clerk know who is speaking and can follow along. We know these are challenging times, and I appreciate our community's willingness to navigate through them together with us. With that, I'd like to call to order the Everett City Council meeting for Wednesday, August 11th, 2021. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Mayor Franklin.
Here.
Councilmember Murphy.
Here.
Councilmember Tui.
Here.
Councilmember Vogely.
Here.
Councilmember Roberts.
Here.
Councilmember Bader.
Here.
Councilmember Moore.
Here.
President Stonecipher.
Here. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes of August 4th, 2021?
Councilmember Bader, so moves.
Roberts, second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Murphy.
Yes.
Councilmember Tui.
Yes.
Councilmember Vogely.
Yes.
Councilmember Roberts.
Yes.
Councilmember Bader.
Yes.
Councilmember Moore. Councilmember Moore.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. Thank you. Moving on to Mayor Franklin. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. I don't have much to say, just a word of caution for our residents. It's going to be a hot few days, so please do what you can to stay cool. Our libraries are open and they can operate as cooling centers. The mall is a great place to get inside and get some cold air if you don't have air conditioning at home. I was just sitting outside enjoying the sun, but the next few days are going to get very hot, so please also check in on your friends and neighbors and make sure that they're know that there's access to these resources. And there's other places throughout the county that will operate as cooling centers as well. So just take care of each other, and no further comment tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to council comments and liaison reports, starting with Councilmember Murphy.
Thank you, Council President. Good evening, everyone. Just a brief comment. I had the opportunity to walk around at the mother of all garage sales in the Northwest neighborhood this past weekend on Saturday. Very well attended, lots of people out shopping and you know, a couple benefits there. Obviously, it's nice for neighbors to be able to get out and see each other. A lot of people were wearing masks, of course, but second benefit, of course, is it allows for a lot of those items that one family might be finished with to get rehomed, so to speak, as opposed to ending up in a landfill. So it was a great event. Really want to thank Carrie Quass, the Northwest Neighborhood leader, and that entire committee that worked so hard to put it together. And really nice event, and appreciate all their work. And that's all I have this evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Tui.
I have no report tonight and no comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Vogely.
The one comment I have is that this weekend, Saturday, down in the West Mount Holly neighborhood, there's going to be a school cleanup, and that starts at 10. I know that I will be at Explorer Middle School, but there are also the other schools in the area that you can join. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Roberts.
Thank you. I too want to tip my hat to Kari Quass and the Northwest neighborhood. They did a great job. And also, you know, city folks were very much involved in helping that. So thanks to all. Last Thursday, the Sound Transit Board met and took the action on realignment, which has been before this council and some presentations and so on. And so I did send out to the council an update, kind of a summary of the actions taken. I don't need to read that here, but I want to just touch on a couple of those highlights. And they do provide an extension to Everett in the first group of projects, and that would get to Southwest Everett by 2037. There was some important amendments that were made, supported by and brought by the Snohomish County Trio, including to bring climate change into the mix and look at ridership, connecting the centers, socioeconomic equity, and building the spine as the surrogates for decarbonizing the transportation system. So that was an important amendment. And another important amendment was to make sure that projects that add cost or scope somewhere else in the system cannot move forward without having the funding in place, and that funding cannot jeopardize the schedules for other projects. So that is important for us to protect our place, so to speak, as we go forward. And last but certainly not least, the amendments provide for our moving as fast as we can to find additional funds, and it gives us the ability, if we find those funds, to advance the schedule from what was approved. So the schedule really is kind of a backstop schedule. That's what happens based on where we are with today's finances, but we have the ability to move forward and have some autonomy based on how successful we are in finding some additional funds. So that's very important. We'll continue to work on that, but I know that was a matter of interest to the council and to the community. And after 17 months, I'm glad that we have come to this point, and it was unanimously approved by the board. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Bader.
Thank you, Council President Stonecipher. First off, attended Parks Board this week, one of my liaison assignments. They presented the Parks Recreation Open Space draft information, I guess, actually, that they've developed so far. By the consultants who were working on this project, included, inventory of our park assets and locations, looking at those things. There was a survey involved. I think about 81 of our residents did a very in-depth survey on that. Talked about, or began to talk about how to address park deficits throughout the city, most particularly in the South End, and also kind of began to talk about possible funding ideas for dealing with that deficit. So anyhow, great presentation, great information. I think Parks Director Bob Leonard is going to be sharing that with the Parks Board, the slides or the PowerPoint, and I'll share that on with you all as soon as I receive it as well. But anyhow, very, very interesting and kind of teeing up for additional conversation. And Councilman Roberts mentioning sound transit. Transit, as many of you know, is an issue near and dear to my heart, as I use transit into Seattle almost every day. I do want to thank Councilman Roberts and the other Snohomish County representatives. I think they got us the best deal they possibly could. But that being said, I think it's still very troubling for Everett. Despite ST3, when it was put on the ballot, telling us they had carefully looked at the finances, and even though we had a short recession, even though we had a red hot real estate market, those are things we all had in the past too, and yet we still are in the situation where funding doesn't work for Everett and gets pushed out again. What happens now guarantees a 2-seat ride for people who want to commute or go into Seattle for almost the next 2 decades now, and that's really, I think, really challenging for Everett commuters. Great that they're going to get to Southwest Everett, but they're not going to build a big parking garage like you may see coming up at some of the stations in North Seattle, or at least that's delayed for even beyond that. So what I fear we're actually going to see is, especially once Linwood opens, far worse traffic, as I am pretty confident that most commuters will largely reject a 2-seat ride, most of those who are using transit now, and instead they'll have to drive all the way into Seattle in large part. This will dramatically impact Everett traffic, even when it gets to Mariner. I don't think most people, especially from North and East County, and that's 2/3 of those who park at Everett Station, by the way. They're not Everett residents, only about 1/3. 2/3 are from out in North and East County that don't even pay into the RTA other than the fares they pay. Those folks aren't going to drive to Everett Station, hop on a bus, then get off a bus at Mariner and Link Light Rail. They're going to probably drive or go someplace where they can find a parking garage, because there probably won't be enough parking at Mariner. So I think this is not good news for Everett. Even though, again, I do salute Councilmember Roberts and the other members for getting the best deal we possibly could. And I think now it's incumbent on Sound Transit to find a way to get revenue from North and East County. It was gerrymandered out after the first Sound Transit vote failed, because I think they saw the handwriting on the wall that the whole enterprise would probably fail if it was kept in. And so how do we get more revenue, and how do we deal with that problem of a 2-seat ride, which I think is going to be a big handicap for most of our existing commuters and create worse traffic. So anyhow, thanks for listening again. I do want to thank Councilman Roberts and our other representatives from Snohomish County for getting us the best deal they possibly could. Thanks. Sorry about being so long-winded.
Thank you. Next, Councilmember Moore.
I pondered saying I have no comments, but I just want to honor, I know Councilmember Roberts and other community leaders have had a passion for transportation, but our community needs to recognize Councilmember Bader. He is I live it, I do it, I have a passion for it. It's important to me. Your comments right there, Scott, don't be thinking that you spoke too much. I think what you did is you informed the community on how little influence we in Snohomish County have. And so I just applaud you for your hard work, your efforts, and your passion, Scott Bader. So thank you for that. No more comments.
Thank you. And I didn't have any comments either, but I do want to comment on Councilmember Bader's comments. And, I admit that I haven't, I've probably been like a lot of our residents that just haven't paid as much attention to how we're dovetailing into the Sound Transit system as I should. I feel more informed than probably the average Everett voter and resident. But one thing I would ask is, I wonder if administration could come forward with a briefing at some point over the next few months, just to kind of let us know what our plans are, because we are slated to have growth that is, obviously a huge number of more jobs and residents in our community, that is going to tax our transportation systems And the way I look at it as I move around our community, we're already pretty tapped out. I think we got a little reprieve because of the pandemic when people weren't getting about, but I commute to Seattle on a regular basis and around the county as well for my day job and client work. And I'm seeing things really ramping right back up to where they were pre-pandemic in terms of traffic delays and congestion. And so I'm just wondering what we are thinking of doing. I know we're looking at our own transit, but are there road improvements that we are thinking that we need to be investing in just to make sure that we can accommodate the growth that we're going to have, given that it looks like, Sound Transit is not going to be a big factor in helping us accommodate the movement of people. So I would love to hear from the street department and the public works people who are planning all those road improvements, and then we know how we are thinking about our transit system and how that could help play a role. But I would sure love to get some information so we can understand how we're planning on meeting the needs that will emerge as we grow. So that's all I have. Is there anything to report from administration?
Thank you, Council President Stonecipher, and certainly we'll be happy to pull together some information for Council in regards to the planning efforts, whether it be through our comprehensive planning or parks planning, and certainly the public works planning as well. Other than that, no administrative update today. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll move on to our city attorney, Mr. Hall. What do you have for us this evening?
Thank you, Council President. I don't have anything to report, and we're not requesting an executive session.
Thank you. Deb Williams, have we received any comments from the community for public comment?
Good evening, President Stonecipher. We received one written comment from Mr. Joe Zlab, and we also have Mr. Zlab waiting to speak this evening. Mr. Zlab, please hit *6 to unmute yourself. Please begin by giving your name and address for the record. Mr. Zlab?
Joe Zlab, Everett, Washington. This is a quick note of thanks to the city staff who helped the residents and businesses on the 2600 block of Rockefeller Avenue by clearing a homeless encampment there last week. We have been experiencing a tenfold impact from homelessness since the emergency homeless shelter was established on this block. Our construction staff have been assaulted by people coming onto our site, and we must watch over our parks vehicles all day long. I know and speak with residents on the block, and they are desperate to have this ongoing concern resolved in a more permanent manner. We would ask that the city's no sit, no lie ordinance be expanded to cover more of the downtown Everett area. We hope to be renting up market rate and affordable apartment units this fall on the block. We have 2 more buildings under design and permitting on the same block and plan to build them if the first one is successful. I'm more than a little concerned about renting up market rate apartment units across the street from an emergency homeless shelter. Anything the city can do to help support our efforts to revitalize downtown Everett will be greatly appreciated. Thanks and best regards, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Zlab. President Stonecipher, he has also provided those comments in writing. Those comments have been provided to the city clerk, the city attorney, and administration as part of the permanent record. And that is all I have this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. We'll move on to our consent agenda. Do I hear a motion to approve the 9 consent items?
Roberts moves approval.
Bader, second.
We have a motion and a second for the consent agenda. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Murphy,
Yes.
Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Bogley,
Yes.
Councilmember Roberts,
Yes.
Councilmember Bader,
Yes.
Councilmember Moore,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. We have 4 items on for proposed action. I'll read 2 of them as they are first readings this evening. Item 12 is Council Bill 2108-26. It's a first reading. Adopt an ordinance amending ordinance number 3734-20 entitled Legion Sport Court Renovation, Fund 354, Program 066, to accumulate all costs for the project in the amount of $318,491. Third and final reading will be on August 25th. Item 13 is Council Bill 2108-27. It's also a first reading. Adopt an ordinance creating the special construction fund entitled Madison Morgan Park Improvements, Fund 354, Program 063, to accumulate the construction costs in the amount of $315,000. The third and final reading of this ordinance will also be on August 25th. Do we have any questions for the 4 proposed action items? If so, unmute yourself and speak now.
Council President Stonecipher, I don't have a question, just a quick comment that I really appreciate in the court renovations that, as we have been in others, including striping for pickleball, which is growing rapidly in popularity. And so it's just great to see that. And I just want the community to know our parks folks are trying to have multi-use with these different courts and facilities. So I want to thank them and admin for bringing that forward. Thanks. That's all I have.
Thank you. I know the pickleball group was advocating with the parks staff, so good for them for getting their needs out there. Hearing no questions.
Vogel here.
Yes.
Sorry. I was gonna mention that it looked like Legion Park Sports Court was totally fixed, and I'm reading it now again. Yeah, it is. They just need help with the parking lot. So way to go, sports courts. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. We will move now to our action items, starting with item number 14, Council Bill 2107-23, adopt an ordinance relating to stormwater controls in the combined sewer area, amending ordinance 3731-20. Do I hear a motion?
Councilmember Bader, so moves.
More seconds.
We have a motion and a second. Let's go down the roll to see if we have questions. Starting with Councilmember Murphy.
Yes, thanks, Council President. The only question, I support this this action. The only question I do have, though, is on the in lieu of stormwater fee that is charged, and I know it's a per square foot fee for the net new impervious areas that might be added, and it's a $3.72 per square foot fee, and I'm just wondering how, if we could be reminded how that is set, and also how and when that gets adjusted, because I think we've all, having served on the council over the years, we've all seen that over time, some of these numbers can get a bit stale, and unless there's a process to update them or a CPI index inflator or something like that, that after a decade or so, you wake up one day and realize that the fees are out of date. So just curious how that is calculated and at what point would it be reviewed or updated? Thanks.
Okay, this is Suhail Nasser, Utility Engineering Manager. This fee was calculated. We had a study done, and that was sent attached to the previous ordinance when the fee was established. It was established based on assessed value of the facilities that we have in the entire city, basically in the north and also in the south, so that we can have the south portion of the city involved. And this is the fair value according to the study that we would be able to recoup about 20% of our cost. So we did not really go for the full amount. And this fee will be revised again and revisited in about 10 years when we go with the second set of CIP projects, when we have more information on new projects moving forward. And the fund and the fee for this that we will be collecting will be only spent on surface water projects within the combined sewer area.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to Councilmember Tui.
No, I have no other further questions, but that was a great question, Councilmember Murphy. Appreciate the answer, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Vogely.
No questions, thanks.
Councilmember Roberts.
Thanks. I just was looking at what looks like additional language that prohibits connections of roof drains to side sewers. I'm assuming that's to try to cut down on the volume load in those side sewers. I asked that question because a lot of people during heavy rain events find that they have water coming into their basements. And sometimes the side sewers are the answer, but there's ways to deal with that. So I'm just curious, is that the purpose of that language?
Yes, it is. And actually in our code, we currently do have that language, not necessarily limited to this ordinance, but yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Councilmember Bader.
Thanks. No questions or comments.
Councilmember Moore.
I also appreciate Councilmember Murphy's attention to detail, and he responded the questions that helped me greatly. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have no questions or comments. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Murphy,
Yes.
Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Vogely,
Yes.
Councilmember Roberts,
Yes.
Councilmember Bader,
Yes.
Councilmember Moore,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. Now we will move on to the council briefing agenda. These items come before the City Council serving as a council committee of the whole and are likely to be scheduled at a future meeting. Item 15 is the police legislative update, new police laws and how they are affecting our city operations and the police response. And I think we have Chief Templeman here to present to us.
Well, good evening, Mayor Franklin and council members. Dan Templeman with the police department. And I just want to introduce Lacey Offit, who is our police legal advisor, and we are going to partner up and deliver this briefing tonight. And so just by way of introduction, Lacey is our police legal advisor. She works for the city prosecutor's office, and she is going to provide kind of the legal review of just 4 of the more than dozen bills related to police and police reform. So just understand that this is just a fraction of the volume of bills that we've been digesting and implementing into department policies and procedures. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lacey, and then I will jump in as soon as she wraps up her portion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And good evening, council members and Mayor Franklin. As the chief said, I'm Lacey Offit, legal advisor to the police department. My goal for tonight and the time that I have is to familiarize you with just a few of the bills that were passed in the 2020-2021 legislative session that affect the Everett Police Department and in turn affect the citizens of Everett. I'm going to summarize the contents of 4 bills for you. Engrossed Substitute House Bill 1054, Engrossed Second Substitute House Bill 1310, Engrossed Second Substitute Senate Bill 5051, and Engrossed Senate Bill 5476. I will very likely refer to these as shorthand just by the numbers. Before I get into the details of each of these, I'd ask that you hold any questions until the end of the briefing. I do have a lot to cover. The bills contain a lot of information. They interact with one another in very subtle and sometimes complex ways. I will do my best to explain the intricacies of each of these in the time that I have allotted. As lawyers sometimes tend to do, I will begin with a caveat. And that is that it is not an exaggeration to tell you that between Everett's police department leadership and the city attorney's office, hundreds of hours have gone into understanding and implementing and training officers on these new bills. There's still much more to be done. And that effort that we've expended has echoed across the state in every law enforcement agency with dozens of legal advisors weighing in. As varied as those other departments are, and as different as they are from our own, their interpretations of the bills are equally diverse. That's not to say that the bills are flawed, only that we have not yet seen them applied in practice. We haven't seen them applied by any courts, and we haven't otherwise been illuminated in a way that guides our own interpretation. So throughout my presentation this evening, I'll highlight the most commonly disputed provisions of each of these bills. Before I jump into the text of the bill, though, I'll take a moment to explain two terms that will become very important in understanding the impact of the bills and the way that we have applied the bills to the Everett Police Department. First, reasonable suspicion, and second, I'll talk about probable cause. An officer who has reasonable suspicion that a person is committing, has committed, or is about to commit a crime may detain that person for a reasonable period of time for continued investigation. A reasonable suspicion must be based on specific, articulable, rational facts known to the officer. You may have heard a shorthand for reasonable suspicion, and that's a Terry stop, and that's named after the US Supreme Court case that created the rule. Reasonable suspicion is a lower threshold of suspicion than probable cause. Probable cause exists when an officer has knowledge or reasonably trustworthy information sufficient to lead a person of reasonable caution to believe that an offense has been committed or is being committed by the person being arrested. You can think of these terms as being on a spectrum. On one side is a person who happens to be in an area where a crime occurred. There is no reasonable suspicion that this person committed a crime until an officer obtains specific, articulable facts distinguishing that person as someone who might have committed a crime. Further along that spectrum, the officer develops probable cause by obtaining additional trustworthy knowledge tying that person to the criminal conduct. On the other end of the spectrum, past probable cause is a person who definitively committed the crime. Officers are trained to distinguish between these levels of proof because their permissible actions are determined by the level that they're at, but there is no bright line rule that exists to guide them. Through that lens, I'll begin with Engrossed Substitute House Bill 1054 relating to tactics and equipment used by police. This bill became effective on July 25th, 2021. As of the date of the law bans chokeholds and neck restraints in the course of an officer's duties, bans no-knock warrants. It prohibits firing at a moving vehicle unless necessary to protect against an imminent threat of serious physical harm. It mandates the development of a model policy for the training and use of canine teams, and that's to be published by January of 2022. It bans tear gas, but excludes from the definition of tear gas OC spray, commonly known as pepper spray. So it bans tear gas except in circumstances involving riots, barricaded subjects, and hostage situations. In any of those three circumstances, additional constraints apply to the use of tear gas. Officers have to first exhaust all alternatives. They have to announce their intent to use tear gas. They have to allow time and space for subjects to disperse, and they have to obtain authorization from a supervisor. In the case of a riot that occurs outside of a correctional, jail, or detention facility, they actually have to obtain authorization from the mayor. 1054 goes on to ban the use or acquisition of military equipment. Military equipment is a defined term in the bill. The bill requires departments to submit an existing inventory of military equipment to the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs by this coming November. It mandates the destruction of any qualifying equipment by December of 2022. As I stated, military equipment is defined in the bill. The definition defines military equipment as firearms and ammunition of 50 caliber or greater, machine guns, armored helicopters, armed or armored drones, armed vessels, armed vehicles, armed aircraft, tanks, long-range acoustic hailing devices, rockets, rocket launchers, bayonets, grenades, missiles, directed energy systems, and electromagnetic spectrum weapons. Primarily, we have been concerned with the definition of military equipment as it relates to the definition including firearms and ammunition of 50 caliber or greater. That particular definition has led to varying interpretations as it relates to some of the less than lethal equipment police departments, including our own, use due to the inclusion of the definition of that firearms and ammunition of 50 caliber or greater. The bill does not define firearms, nor does it define caliber, and the bill does not make any explicit exception for equipment that technically meets the definition, but that is used for less lethal purposes. In addition, despite the name, it is not limited to equipment that is obtained from the military. For example, Everett Police Department uses both 40mm and 37mm launchers, to fire less than lethal rounds, but each has a bore diameter of greater than 50 caliber and is considered a firearm, thereby meeting the statutory definition of military equipment. Finally, 1054 changes the landscape of permissible vehicle pursuits unless there is probable cause, which, as I stated, is a fair probability under all of the circumstances that this person committed a violent offense, a sex offense, or escape offense. The bill also permits vehicle pursuits if an officer has reasonable suspicion, and remember, that's a suspicion based on articulable facts that the person is driving under the influence. Any vehicle pursuit meeting these criteria must additionally be necessary to apprehend or ID the person. The person has to be an imminent threat to the safety of others. The safety risks of failing to apprehend the person outweigh the risks of the pursuit, and the pursuit is authorized by a supervisor. Next, I'll discuss Engrossed Second Substitute House Bill 1310. This bill creates a civil standard for use of force by police officers. 1310 authorizes a peace officer to use physical force, a term that is not defined in the bill, against a person in only four circumstances. First, when it is necessary to, quote, protect against criminal conduct where there is probable cause to make an arrest, when necessary to, quote, effect an arrest, when necessary to prevent escape crimes, and when necessary to, quote, protect against an imminent threat of bodily injury to the peace officer, another person, or the person against whom force is being used. In the context of using physical force, as opposed to deadly force, which I'll discuss in a moment, the bill does not define imminent threat of bodily injury or necessary. In addition to describing when physical force is authorized, the bill creates a new duty of reasonable care. When determining whether to use physical force and when using physical force, a peace officer shall, when possible, exhaust available and appropriate de-escalation tactics. The bill goes on to list examples of de-escalation tactics that the officers shall exhaust. Those include creating physical distance by employing tactical repositioning and repositioning as often as necessary to maintain the benefit of time, distance, and cover. When there are multiple officers, this includes designating one officer to communicate in order to avoid competing commands, calling for additional resources such as a crisis intervention team or mental health professional, calling for backup officers when encountering resistance, taking as much time as necessary without using physical force or weapons, and leaving the area if there is no threat of imminent harm and no crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. Furthermore, when determining whether to use physical force and when using physical force, the officer should use the least amount of physical force necessary to overcome resistance, and has to take into consideration a person's known characteristics, such as whether a person is pregnant, a minor, a vulnerable adult, displays signs of mental, behavioral, or physical impairments or disability, is suicidal, has limited English proficiency, is in the presence of children, or is experiencing perceptual or cognitive impairments typically related to the use of alcohol, narcotics, hallucinogens, or other drugs. I highlight this last part, experiencing perceptual or cognitive impairments typically related to the use of alcohol, narcotics, hallucinogens, or other drugs, because the context of this bill indicates that the presence of perceptual or cognitive impairments should lead an officer to use less force. However, this is occasionally in contrast to an officer's known experience where a person's perceptual or cognitive impairments related to the use of narcotics, hallucinogens, or other drugs may actually require additional use of force. The standard example is somebody who has perhaps ingested methamphetamine is oftentimes more combative and would require a greater amount of force in order to overcome the resistance. This is easily the largest source of debate involving the bill. The biggest source of debate involving the bill isn't necessarily about what the bill says, but it's about what the bill does not say. Specifically, the bill does not explicitly allow for any physical force to detain someone based on reasonable suspicion, which, if you recall, is suspicion based on articulable facts. Rather, the language contemplates physical force where there is probable cause or a fair probability under all of the circumstances that the person against whom force is being used committed a crime. The bill also does not explicitly permit officers to use physical force when detaining someone pursuant to the Involuntary Treatment Act, which is contained in RCW 7105, which permits an officer to take a person into custody when the person suffers from a behavioral health disorder and poses an imminent likelihood of serious harm or is in imminent danger because the person is gravely disabled. Similarly, the bill is silent as to explicit authorization to use physical force when responding to medical calls or calls where police are asked to assist emergency medical services. Definitive answers as to these apparent discrepancies will require judicial interpretation or additional legislative action to clarify. Meanwhile, we have used all of our tools to discern what we believe to be the most prudent interpretation. Bill 1310 also discusses an officer's use of deadly force. And what the bill says is an officer is authorized to use deadly force only when necessary to protect against an imminent threat of serious physical injury or death to the officer or another person. For the purposes of deadly force, 1310 does define imminent threat of serious physical injury or death as being based on the totality of the circumstances. It is objectively reasonable to believe that a person has the present and apparent ability, opportunity, and intent to immediately cause death or serious injury to the peace officer or another person. For the purposes of deadly force, 1310 similarly defines what necessary means as being under the totality of the circumstances, a reasonably effective alternative to the use of deadly force does not exist, and that the amount of force used was a reasonable and proportional response to the threat posed to the officer and others. When the officer must use less lethal alternatives, the officer must use less lethal alternatives before using deadly force whenever possible. Finally, 1310 prohibits an officer from using tactics prohibited by law or by department policy, except to protect his or her life or the life of another person. All of these use of force directives became effective on law enforcement on July 25th, 2021. The bill, however, mandates the Attorney General develop and publish model policies consistent with the bill's edicts, and the Attorney General has until July of 2022 to publish those. The bill I just discussed, 1310, interacts in a couple of different ways that I'll highlight with the next bill I want to discuss, which is Engrossed Second Substitute Senate Bill 5051. This bill amends the process by which an officer is certified or remains certified and can be placed on probation, suspended, or decertified as a peace officer. The Criminal Justice Training Commission, or CJTC, you might hear me say, is the certifying body for all Washington police officers. It is also the body responsible for suspending or revoking that certification or imposing remedial training requirements on the officer upon finding of any misconduct. Following the passage of 5051, the commission itself went from 16 members to a body of 21 members. They serve 6-year terms. The makeup is determined by the statute, and the members are appointed by the governor. Notably, the commission will now, following the passage of 5051, include an additional 5 private citizens, an attorney with experience in matters related to enhancing law enforcement practices and accountability, and a person with civilian oversight or auditing experience over law enforcement agencies. The commission is now newly empowered to issue public recommendations to the governing body of an agency. In our case, that would be this city council, regarding the police department's command decisions, inadequacy of policy or training, investigations or disciplinary decisions regarding misconduct, potential systemic violations of the law or policy, unconstitutional policing, or, quote, other matters. Under this bill, an individual is now authorized to submit a complaint to the commission stating that an officer's certification should be denied, suspended, or revoked. Prior to 5051, only an officer or agency representative could make such a complaint to the commission. The commission is empowered to investigate any complaint and determine what action to take. In addition, the commission may, at its own discretion, initiate decertification proceedings. The bill enumerates the circumstances under which it may or must suspend or revoke certification. Some of these have not changed, and some of them are new under 5051. The Criminal Justice Training Commission must deny or revoke certification of a peace officer if the applicant or the officer has been convicted of certain crimes, a felony, gross misdemeanor, domestic violence offenses, sex offenses, or an offense with sexual motivation. If the officer has been terminated for engaging in or found by a court to have engaged in the use of force which resulted in death or serious injury, and that use of force also violated the law, that is a mandatory decertification. Also mandatory decertification if the officer has been terminated for witnessing or found by a court to have witnessed another officer's use of excessive force and failed to intervene or failed to report excessive force. Has been found by a court to have made knowingly misleading, deceptive, untrue, or fraudulent representations in the practice of being a police officer or a peace officer. Or if the officer is prohibited from possessing weapons by state, federal law, or by a permanent court order entered after a hearing. Those are reasons that the CJTC must revoke an officer's certification. 5051 enumerates a number of ways in which the CJTC may elect to deny, suspend, or revoke certification. They may also require remedial training of the police officer or the applicant in the case of a new hire. The CJTC may deny, suspend, or revoke certification if the officer failed to timely meet all training requirements, was previously issued a certificate, through administrative error, knowingly falsified or omitted material information on an application to the employer, or for training or certification to the commission. If the officer interfered with an investigation or action for denial or revocation of certification by making false statements, failed to report information as required by law or policy, or tampering with evidence or intimidating a witness. 5051 also permits the CJTC to deny, suspend, or revoke certification if the officer engaged in a use of force that could reasonably be expected to cause injury and the use of force violated law or policy. This particular provision interacts with the bill I just discussed, 1310, in that 1310 enumerates the instances in which an officer may use force. In the event that that use of force is determined to have violated 1310, the commission would be empowered, may be empowered to deny, suspend, or revoke certification if that use of force is found to have violated the new law or violated department policy. Other reasons the CJTC may deny or suspend certification would be if the officer committed sexual harassment, through fraud or misrepresentation, used the position of a peace officer or corrections officer for personal gain. If the officer is found to have committed, to engage in conduct involving prejudice or discrimination against a person, including online posts. If the officer has affiliation with one or more extremist organizations. Important to note here, affiliation and extremist organizations are not defined terms. If the officer has been suspended or discharged or resigned or retired in lieu of discharge for any conduct listed in this section that I just discussed, or has voluntarily surrendered the person's certification as a police officer, the CJTC may suspend or deny or revoke their certification. Additionally, the CJTC may now deny, suspend, or revoke certification if an officer is found to have either on or off duty committed a felony, engaged in a pattern of acts showing an intentional or reckless disregard for the rights of others, and that includes constitutional rights of others, engaged in unsafe practices involving firearms, weapons, or vehicles, indicating a willful disregard for the safety of persons or property. And finally, if the officer is found to have on or off duty engaged in conduct that failed to meet the ethical and professional standards required of an officer, or that disrupts, diminishes, or otherwise jeopardizes the public trust in the criminal justice system, or that demonstrates an inability or unwillingness to uphold the officer's oath to enforce state and federal laws and constitutions. All of those are reasons the CJTC may take action against an officer's certification. In the event of a revocation or suspension hearing, a hearing is presided over by an administrative law judge, and a 5-member panel determines the decision by a preponderance of the evidence. The 5-member panel is now made up of 2 members of law enforcement and 3 non-law enforcement members. This represents a significant change in the panel makeup and the burden of proof. Prior to 5051, the burden of proof was higher. There had to have been a finding by clear, cogent, and convincing evidence. The 5-member panel was formerly comprised of 4 members of law enforcement and 1 civilian. I want to take just a moment to discuss these differences in burdens of proof. As I just stated, formerly, the CJTC panel had to make a finding by clear, cogent, and convincing evidence. While not an exact science, you can think of clear, cogent, and convincing evidence as about 75% sure that what is being alleged to have happened. That's a very rough estimate, but about that level of surety. Now, as I stated, the panel determines a decision by a preponderance of the evidence. This can be understood, again, not an exact science, but it can be understood as about 51%. So this does represent a significant lowering of that burden. One final note, 5051 directs agencies to observe exacting reporting requirements when officer conduct that may result in revocation becomes known, and imposes a civil penalty of up to $10,000 for failure to timely and accurately report information to the commission. Finally, I want to briefly discuss Engrossed Senate Bill 5476. By now, you are all familiar with the state Supreme Court's decision in Blake that struck down the possession of a controlled substance crime as unconstitutional. That occurred in February of this year, and in response, the legislature passed Senate Bill 5476. That bill allocated over $80 million to invest in substance use treatment services. The bill also convenes an advisory group to study and establish a statewide system for addressing substance use disorders. 5476 went into effect on an emergency basis, which means that it became effective for all law enforcement in the state of Washington on May 3rd of this year. However, the services and the structure and the infrastructure that I just mentioned that the bill funds are clearly not in working order yet. What the bill also goes on to do is make the knowing possession of a controlled substance a misdemeanor. Previously, it was a felony. That means it's punishable by up to 90 days in jail or a $1,000 fine. In addition, the bill decriminalizes large portions of the possession of drug paraphernalia statute, which is now limited to those pieces of paraphernalia associated commonly with the manufacture and sale of controlled substances, leaving personal use paraphernalia largely decriminalized. In June, this body adopted the criminal provisions of Senate Bill 5476 into the Everett Municipal Code, clearing the way for Everett Police Department to resume some drug enforcement within the city. However, the edicts of 5476 and adopted in Everett Code prohibit jail booking or referral to the prosecutor to file charges unless that person has been diverted to a referral for assessment and services at least twice previously. Importantly, the bill does not define what is a referral. So we have largely been left to our own devices to determine what is going to satisfy the edicts of this bill. In practice, when an officer develops probable cause for possession of a controlled substance, he or she must then determine whether the person has been referred for services at least twice before. If the person has not been referred to services twice before, then the officer may refer the individual for services. If the person has been referred to services twice before, then the officer may, but is not required to, arrest and book that person for the crime, or they may issue a criminal citation or simply refer the charges to the city prosecutor for review and possible prosecution. The bill does not mandate that prosecutors defer any such referrals or criminal citations, but does encourage city prosecutors to allow for additional referrals to services beyond the two that the officers must document. Everett officers have been trained in this referral process. As of last week, the prosecutor's office has filed its first possession of a controlled substance case ever, reminding you that this was previously a felony, so we did not have jurisdiction over it. In addition, officers have completed dozens of referrals for services, hopefully directing people to the services that they need to address any substance abuse issues that they may have. With that, I will hand it over to Chief Templeman to discuss the police department's response in the wake of these 4 bills. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Lacey. I appreciate you providing that foundation for me and really synthesizing what is truly, in my opinion, fairly complicated legislation into a manner in which council and our public can consume and hopefully understand. So I'd like to start by just saying, you know, one of my challenges as the chief, right, is now taking what Lacey just shared with each of you and transitioning that from legislation and bills and laws into department policies and procedures and protocols. And what does that mean on the street at 3 o'clock in the morning when an officer's out responding to a call? And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. I do want to start as well as Lacey did with a few disclaimers. First of all, I want to make sure, and I think that council understands this, as chief of police here in Everett, I am not anti-change. I believe that my history would show that I am a fairly progressive chief that is open to innovation and looking at different ways to police our community and ensure that we're meeting the expectations of our community. And that I will also say that I align very much with a lot of the goals of the legislation, particularly more de-escalation and increasing de-escalation training and abilities for officers and skills, as well as decreasing use of force in interactions like that between officers and the public. The purpose of my portion of the briefing tonight is really to share with council and the public how these laws, again, have led to changes in the Everett Police Department policies and procedures and our response protocols. I'm not here tonight to debate or argue over the interpretations of these bills. As you can see, I along with my peer chiefs and the sheriffs from across the state of Washington, have relied heavily, due to lack of clear guidance, have relied heavily on our legal advisors and prosecutors throughout the state to help us and guide us through this process and land hopefully in an area that is consistent with the law and the intent as well. I do want to mention that at this time there has not been a formal Attorney General's office opinion. There's been some misinformation. There has been a communication from the Attorney General as it relates to one of the bills, but it is not legal advice. It is not binding, but there has been a request to the Attorney General's office to provide an opinion, an actual formal opinion on a couple of these bills that I believe will help clear up. It doesn't necessarily change the law, but it would help clear up the intent and maybe provide departments with a little bit more clear guidance. So what I want to really share tonight is that these new laws have already and will change how the Everett Police Department responds to certain types of calls for service. But at the same time, we have not adopted, as some police departments have throughout the state, we have not adopted a blanket no response to certain police calls for service. So we are still responding to all police calls for service that come into 911 or come into our non-emergency line. However, that response may look a little different than it has prior to July 25th. And what we do after we respond may look different as well. I want to acknowledge that some of these adjustments that we've made at this point may frustrate some of our community members. And for this, I do apologize. But I want to reemphasize that we are doing our best to follow and adhere to the new state laws. And I do believe that there are some members of our community that are going to have to reset their expectations when it comes to relying upon law enforcement to solve many of the issues that occur on our streets that may not necessarily be law enforcement related issues. And then lastly, before I jump into how these bills have directly affected our policies, I do want to say that I will, as will Lacey, we will both do our best to answer your questions, council members. But the reality is, with what we're dealing with, we may not be able to answer all of your questions. And particularly that's because there is no case law, there is no history that we can rely upon. So, but we will do our best. So I do want to also mention that it's important for the community to understand and for council to remember that many of the provisions of these bills, the Everett Police Department had, even prior to July 25th, had policies and practices in place that were consistent with many of the provisions. And for example, we had a duty to intervene or a duty to intercede policy prior to Senate Bill 5066 passing, which required that all departments have policies on duty to intervene and duty to report wrongdoing. We already had a policy in place. And if you recall, and I've mentioned this, that the Everett Police Department was selected as one of initially 35 agencies in the US and Canada to be part of the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement program out of the Georgetown Law Innovative Policing Program. So we, have a policy in place. We had a policy in place prior. We in the Everett Police Department had already banned chokeholds and LVNRs, which are lateral vascular neck restraints. We had not executed no-knock warrants in as long as I can recall. We now have policy that specifically prohibits it, but in practice, we were not executing no-knock warrants. Our use of tear gas, I don't know when the last time was that we have deployed tear gas. We have a very restrictive policy on traffic pursuits, and we have always restricted by policy firing at or into moving vehicles. So I do want to make sure that everybody understands that we have already implemented several of these changes prior to these laws. So I want to start with House Bill 1054, and I, like Lacey, I'm going to just refer to it as 1054. This is the police tactics bill, and it limits certain or prohibits certain practices. I'm only going to touch on two elements that really affected our department significantly, and one of them Lacey touched on, and that was the ban on military equipment and that definition of the 50 caliber or greater firearms and ammunition. And she did mention to you that the Everett Police Department prior to July 25th did have what we call less than lethal launchers and ammunition. So launchers that fired plastic projectiles and or sponge rounds instead of bullets. And so they're considered less than lethal devices. And we did have those deployed in our patrol and with our regional riot response team. And because of the way the legislation is written, and relying again upon the interpretation of not only our legal advisor, but other legal advisors who had some of the same advice, we have pulled all of those launchers from our patrol officers and our riot team. And of course, as you can imagine, the result of that, right, is that we have fewer, less lethal options now on our street than we had prior to July 25th. We have evaluated since that time some new launchers and new projectiles, and we've already placed orders. Again, this would be what I would consider an unfunded mandate that we have placed these orders. However, because other agencies are in the same position as we are in line to receive these devices, and we don't know when those are gonna come in. Again, this is one of those areas where I am hopeful, although I'm not sure, but I'm hopeful that the Attorney General's office will issue a formal opinion clarifying this issue. And again, that doesn't change the law, but that may make myself and our legal advisor a little bit more comfortable bringing some of those tools back to our officers. The other element of 1054 I wanted to touch on, he just had to do with pursuits. As I mentioned earlier, the Everett Police Department already had restrictive policy as it relates to traffic pursuits. They're obviously very dangerous to the officer and to our public. And so we've had probably one of the more restrictive pursuit policies in Snohomish County for over a dozen years. However, I will note this, that our policy never required probable cause. So if our officers were responding to a call involving a violent offense, and they had developed reasonable suspicion that the individual responsible for that crime was in that vehicle, if the crime was serious enough, they were allowed to pursue. And again, now that will not be the case unless they can establish that higher level of proof, which is probable cause. So to clarify that means, for example, in the law today, the new law articulates violent offenses, violent sex offenses, and reasonable suspicion for DUI. So not included in those violent offenses are crimes like burglary of a residence, most domestic violence offenses, most hate crimes, and assaults on police officers. Those are just some examples of crimes that are not included in that definition of violent felony offenses. I want to move on to House Bill 1310, which again, this one, as Lacey mentioned, is the one that's probably causing the most confusion, the most angst, the most anxiety with police officers, and even I think with members of our public. And Again, this one is the bill that establishes the statewide physical and deadly force standards for all police departments. It does have some important new mandates, and some of those mandates I fully support, and I want to make sure that that is known. Elements such as using de-escalation techniques prior to the use of physical force when available, using the least amount of physical force in any sort of encounter with a community member, terminating the use of force as soon as the necessity to use force ends, and when possible, using less lethal alternatives prior to the use of deadly force. And certainly making more less lethal options available to our officers. Right now, we are in the process of piloting, or will be very soon, another new, less lethal device that I'm very excited about. And I think it's going to provide an excellent resource for our officers to be able to take someone into custody without putting their hands on them initially, and reduce the propensity for injuries. So hopefully more to come on that after we get going with our pilot. But again, this bill 1310 significantly narrows when officers can use physical force, and physical force is not defined in the statute. And it's important to note that under that reasonable care standard, this element that Lacey mentioned, that an officer should consider leaving the scene of whatever call they're on if no probable cause exists and there's no imminent threat of harm. So what's happening? How does that now translate onto the street and into our policies? Well, officers now are very, very carefully and methodically evaluating the nature and the circumstances of each call they're responding to. Now, it's not going to change that, shooting call, that robbery in progress call, that assault in progress call. The officers are still going to roll to those. They're still going to try to get as much information as they can to see if they can develop probable cause while they're getting there. But the bottom line is that these officers now, especially on some of the welfare check calls and some of these other calls that are not high priority emergency calls, they're asking a lot more questions before they even get there. They want to make sure that they're in compliance with the law should a use of force become necessary, because as I can tell you from being on the street myself, you cannot always predict when you're going to have to use force. These situations can change very, very rapidly, and they're unpredictable. Another challenge has arisen as it relates to 1310, and that has to do with our assistance that we provide, or typically have provided, to designated crisis responders. These are social workers that are specially trained and go out and will take individuals into custody that may need some sort of a mental health evaluation. And again, because 1310 does not specifically address or authorize officers to use force in those situations, officers now, after July 25th, have been a lot more cautious in terms of responding to those calls and what our role is in those calls. Same with fire department calls for EMS assistance. We may respond to those calls. We may be in the area. We may not go in first and secure the scene and make sure it's safe for a DCR or for an EMS worker first, because those are non-criminal calls, so there's no probable cause for a crime. And if the officer cannot determine that there's an imminent threat at that particular moment, the officer, if they use force, could potentially face decertification. One last thing I just want to mention again, and Lacey touched on it, the Terry stops, or the reasonable suspicion detentions. There's been a lot of disagreement about this and whether or not officers are allowed to use reasonable force to detain somebody in these circumstances. We have taken a conservative approach on this, particularly because there is no clear guidance on it, and the impact or the outcome on an officer's career could be significant if we get it wrong. So currently, Everett Police Policy does not authorize officers to use any physical force to detain a person unless that officer has first developed probable cause that a crime has been committed and the person we're contacting committed that crime. The officers can certainly ask somebody to stop when they're investigating, but if that person refuses to stop and the officer does not have probable cause, we will let that person go. And we will still investigate the crime. I mean, we may develop probable cause after the fact, and so we'll still investigate it. But unfortunately, that may mean that we're not able to take somebody into custody, a suspect, at the time. So many of you may be asking right now, why such a conservative approach? Why not push the limit? We've heard this. I've heard this in the community. Why not follow the advice that some have shared publicly, that these new laws don't change police response at all and shouldn't change police response to non-criminal calls for service? Well, again, that ties into that Senate Bill 5051, which is the decertification bill. And again, one of those new provisions allows for the Criminal Justice Training Commission to decertify an officer who is found to have engaged in a use of force that's either in violation of the law or violation of department policy. And I really feel it's my duty as chief to enact policies and procedures that are lawful and that limit the civil exposure of the city and the officer, and that also minimize their risks of decertification. And because of the newness of these laws and the lack of any official guidance from any official governing authority, I have chosen to take a conservative approach and follow our legal advisor's advice in most of these issues. The end result, I can assure you and the public, is going to be a reduction in the use of force. However, it still remains to be seen exactly how these new laws will ultimately impact the overall safety of our public on our streets and in our communities. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on briefly, and I'll probably touch on it a little bit more in the next briefing, really has to do with the Blake decision in the 5476. This bill does have a direct impact on how officers respond and manage calls for service involving drug use. And our arrests and referrals for drug use have dropped dramatically for both drug possession and possession of drug paraphernalia. What I want the public to know, and you council members to know, is that if they see somebody that's using drugs on the sidewalk in front of their home, and they call the police, that an officer will show up, and they may see the officer talk to the individual, provide them a little card, and leave the scene. And again, I understand that this may be frustrating to some of our citizens in the community, but we're following the state law, and I will ensure that our officers follow the state law. So I am pleased to see that there's been, over $80 million designated to help provide additional resources. I would love to have seen some of that in place before this bill went into effect, but nonetheless, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to add resources and navigators in the near future. So as I conclude, I just want to reemphasize to our community that public safety still remains of paramount importance to the Everett Police Department, and we're going to do everything we can to still respond to these calls for service and resolve them in a way that's compliant with the law and hopefully meets the expectations of most of our community. And I want to reassure our citizens that we're doing our best to maintain the highest levels of service to our community. And lastly, we are in the final stages of developing a resource card that our officers can provide to community members when we do respond to some of these calls and we're not able to take action like we may have done prior to July 25th. And we're also putting the final touches on a public web page that community members can go to that will provide them with more information on these laws and how they've affected our policies and procedures. So that concludes my portion of this briefing this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. That's certainly a lot of information. We'll go down the roll and see what questions or comments my colleagues have. And we start tonight with Councilmember Murphy.
Thank you, Council President. Yes, certainly a lot to digest there. Lacey and Chief Templeman, appreciate the briefing. I may have some other comments here after I listen to my colleagues, but I guess my comment initially is that, and I think it was touched on, but I think probably we can all agree that the idea that we have some sort of police reforms that make sense is a good idea. And unfortunately, what seems to have happened here is that in the legislature's rush to sort of get this pushed through, these reforms, they've left all of us out in the communities in a situation where our police are dealing with these day-to-day situations without clear guidance, and effectively we've tied one hand behind their back. So that is obviously very concerning. The idea that this ambiguity could be in place for the next year, and I think it was said that while these laws took effect in July 25th, 2021, the AG's office has another year to be able to provide clarifying guidance, and that just is mind-boggling to me that that the AG's office would not be providing that guidance sooner. So I guess my first question would be whether or not we think it's possible to seek a sooner clarification from the AG's office. There must be many police departments across the state that need this guidance sooner than later. So is there any thought that we might be able to get the AG's office to accelerate their clarification for us?
Councilmember Murphy, I have heard, and again, I've heard that the Attorney General's office is in receipt of a request from the authors of some of these bills to provide some additional clarification. And I've been told that the Attorney General's office will be providing guidance. I don't know the timeline for that. I'm hopeful because of the impact that this has had on police departments across the state and the disagreement, if you will, over how these are being interpreted, that they will make that a priority.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good news. I mean, obviously waiting a year for clarification is just really, you know, the legislature has not put us in a very good spot. And we're going to end up with situations where police officers are either unclear on what action they should take, or they end up making a snap decision based on the totality of the facts in front of them, and they're going to end up potentially being in a spot where they're later, as a Monday morning quarterback, ruled to have made an incorrect decision, and that's just not a fair situation to put our law enforcement in. So I hope that we can get some sooner clarification, and I'll gather my thoughts here, but that's my main concern right now. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll move to Councilmember Tui.
Yeah, thank you, Council President, and thank you guys so much for this presentation. A lot of information. I think for me, the key on anything when we have this many changes is that we get an update frequently, so we can see how these changes are working, how the funding is getting to us, and those kinds of things, or the challenges, further challenges that you might have. And if we can get, you know, monthly updates on this or every other month, I think would be great, because it's going to be hard for us to keep track of all of this. And until we really, the officers really get out on the street, there may be other challenges that hadn't anticipated. So it would sure be great to get an update from you more, on an ongoing basis. And I appreciate everything you guys did tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to Councilmember Vogely.
President Stonecipher, please go
Yes.
ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, with just a temporary delay, I actually want to give my hats off to Pipa Escalante, who's in our, who runs our Everett TV, and her team, because what could have been a complete disaster has been handled in less than the space of a few minutes. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming together. We're back at it, and we will continue where we left off. I think that was with Councilmember Vogely was posing her questions to Chief Templeman and Lacey Offit from the police department. Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you. That was a bit exciting. So I'm just going to start over, but be a little more succinct with like the very first part. And the Everett Police Department has been trained in de-escalation techniques since before it was popular. And the requirement to use de-escalation does not prohibit an officer from responding to a call. It does limit when officers are authorized to use force. So I was giving massive kudos to Everett PD, because with the leadership of Dan Templeman and of course our mayor, who is, you know, the boss, we have been doing well, and that has been proven. We all make mistakes. There have been some not well things going on, but some proof to that is the body camera video of the when we were doing the pilot project of when the officers were chasing a man across, well, they weren't on the rooftops, but he was, and he ended up getting on the ground basically on his own, and there was like no speakable force, and he was put up in like 14 seconds from a supine position. So anyways, that was good. And then another instance where EPD went and I think helped the EMS, and there was a person being transported to the hospital, and he was being violent, I believe, at least from what I heard. They were able to de-escalate a violent situation without violence. And so I am giving kudos and another word that I can't think of right now to our police department, because they've been trained and they are using their training. And I think that being worried about these new laws, while change is difficult, I don't think this is going to stop you, the general police officer, you from doing your job, because your job isn't to kill people. Your job is to keep people safe, right? So you've been trained to do that, and you can do it. I think this isn't, it's more of a rhetorical question. Chief, do you have faith in your officers to greet each situation with care rather than fear? And are you willing to give your officers the time they need to turn an elevated situation into a calm one? I think that you do have faith in them, and I think that you are willing to give them time. There's some questions that really don't need to be said out loud, but I have heard the refrain time and again that these new laws will further constrict what a peace officer can do. And I've also heard people say it's time to buy a gun because the cops can't do their job anymore. And that makes me a little bit nervous because A, what does that tell us about what people think the cops' job is, right? Is it just because they carry a gun and should be able to use their machismo to come and force people to bend to their will? No. You know, you guys and gals, so guys as a non-binary term, you don't need to have a bad guy in order to be a good guy. And I think that your officers know that, and I think you know that, and I think that we're going to be okay, and people are still going to be treated respectfully and with care. And like you said, Chief, there will be less physical force. That's all I will say right now. Thank you for all of the information, and thank you for having faith in your team.
Brenda, I think you're muted, but
Sorry, Councilmember Roberts.
I read your lips. Thank you. Thanks, President Stonecipher. And so Lacey and Dan, thanks so much. This is a lot of information, and as you walk through it, I couldn't help but think first, as has been noted, our department has been a leader. You know, it's been said, so let me just say thank you for the tremendous leadership in our department, way ahead of a lot of these changes. You know, so I have some questions as you walk through them, but let me start with, Chief, you have been recognized statewide as a leader, and I know, I'm sure we all are, but I know I'm extremely proud that you have been engaged in some of the legislation. You've been there to try to help give a perspective from a department that's really on the cutting edge. Are you anticipating that we might see, or that you might be recommending some legislative changes? I will call them tweaks, because I think you've clearly made the commitment to reform, but some of the changes, or there may be changes that might be proposed in 2022. So I wanted to ask that question and see what your thoughts are going forward.
Thanks, Councilmember Roberts. And yes, I do anticipate that we will be putting forth our recommendations for providing some additional clarity around some of the most some of those subject areas that both Lacey and I covered, where there has been disagreement throughout the state from legal advisors. And I believe that will be very helpful for chiefs and sheriffs, and even more for the officers, deputies, and troopers on the road that are the ones that are ultimately responsible for compliance with these laws. So I do anticipate in the next session that there will be at least requests made to provide some additional clarity.
Well, I'm going to guess by your telling us that you would bring those forward, and that we might be able to include those after we've seen and talked about them, of course, but included in our legislative agenda for the city, so that we can try to get behind that. I know you have been extremely thoughtful in your work here, and I look forward to hearing and seeing what those recommendations might be. The next question I have is, it seems that the shift that was identified in ESSP 5050 in the training system places an additional workload there. I know that we have had some challenges in the past in making sure that the training center was able to do the things we need to do in order to bring officers through the system. And so I just couldn't help but listen to the discussion and think, this is an additional role. And does that mean that they will be able to meet the needs that we need to get officers trained and certified?
Yeah, that's a great question, Council Member. And the answer to that is yes. You know, I don't know that we're going to see a decreased wait time necessarily in terms of getting our new officers into the academy. Although right now we're looking at about 2 months, you know, about 8 weeks generally to get them in. Sometimes it's a little bit quicker. My understanding is that this additional oversight responsibility it comes with additional funding and additional staff to manage those additional responsibilities.
Thanks. The next question I have is in terms of 5476, which addresses that change in misdemeanor, felony, drug issues, and so on. if I heard correctly, it seems as though there's a cost shift associated with that a felony would have gone into the Superior Court system, but the misdemeanor goes to the municipal court system. And that means there is not only a change in the venue, so to speak, but there's a cost burden that goes with that. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you are correct.
So it would seem, and if you're able to bring back to us, maybe I should say, when you are able to bring back to us some recommendations as far as the 2022 session is concerned, I guess I would request that we are able to get your best estimate on what the unfunded mandates are for this legislation, so that we can at least articulate that to our representatives and try to seek some funding to offset those burdens that are going to be brought to the city and the city taxpayers as a result of the legislation. And then the last question I have is really for you and our officers. It does seem like, it's hard, if I heard it correctly, it's hard to understand that burglaries or hate crimes or domestic violence crimes might not have a response as people have imagined. And I guess if I heard that correctly, I heard it correctly, but I'm just imagining the real world when officers are actually in a situation trying to make those judgments. I can see that to be complicated, and hopefully we'll get more guidance so that they can do their jobs with some certainty and predictability, but it seems as though that's a challenge right now. And I think the citizens don't, I know I didn't understand that until this evening, and I'm pretty sure citizens don't as well. So I'm just concerned that we find some ways to message that in our community to help people understand that this is the case. So if that's true, then I think there needs to be some, hopefully we can try to get that out with the council neighborhoods or some other places so people understand what the legislation has provided in terms of policing.
I apologize if I presented that in a way that was difficult to follow. Our investigation and response to hate crimes or misdemeanor domestic violence calls or burglary calls, that is not going to change. I was presenting that information in the context of House Bill 1054, specifically the traffic pursuit section. And as I was delineating, now there's a specific list of crimes for which officers are authorized to pursue. And among those are not crimes like burglary, domestic violence. It does not mean that we can't still investigate. It doesn't mean we're still not going to respond to those calls and serve our victims the way that we have. But we may not be able to apprehend a suspect at that particular moment if it involves a traffic pursuit. So hopefully that adds clarification.
Well, thanks. You don't need to apologize, Dan. I was trying to understand if I heard it correctly, and I appreciate the clarification. So thank you. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go to Councilmember Bader.
Not quick enough on the clicks here. Sorry. Thanks, Council President Stonecipher. Appreciate that. Dan and Lacey, thanks very much for this great presentation. I think I have two questions and then a comment. Late last week, Attorney General Ferguson issued client advice, I think you noted. Did that cause you to change your advice to the city attorney's advice to our officers, or did that provide any clarity at all from your perspective?
From my perspective, it is not something, I think the chief noted, not an official opinion, and so therefore it does carry less weight as far as what we advise our officers to do in light of it. That particular opinion also did not change kind of how we'd already been interpreting the bill in the first place. And so it did not provide additional clarity as far as my understanding, and I think I will speak for the chief in this, it did not move the needle on what our response will be.
Thank you. And Question for Chief, perhaps. Chief Templeman, do you have any concerns that this legislation is going to make it harder to retain or hire police officers in Everett?
Well, I think time will tell, Councilmember Bader. I do know that that there is concern amongst our officers. I do know that, you know, we have been fortunate in the last several years to have a pretty deep pool of out-of-state laterals that we're looking to lateral into Washington State. These will be data points that we'll be monitoring. I can tell you right now that in just the last couple months, our candidate pool, the quality has dropped significantly, and that we are really closely monitoring our out-of-state lateral applications to see whether or not we see a drop in that as well. You know, it's still a wonderful profession to get into, and it's a noble profession, and it's one that you can still make a difference in the community. So, you know, I know that we still have good people in our community that would be great police officers. And so I don't want it to discourage, because we need good police officers now more than ever before. But we will be monitoring that to see what kind of impact potentially some of this has on that.
Great. Thank you. This was a really good presentation and very useful. I think it's helpful for for the public to know this information that you shared with us. And so certainly I think I'll be referring people as they approach me with concerns about law enforcement. The last thing I'd like to say is it just seems to me that there's such confusion and lack of clarity on so many of these items. And I think it's vital for public safety to get the ambiguity sorted out as soon as possible. So if there's another council member who would support this, I'd like to ask our city's attorney's office to draft a resolution for us to consider, calling on the governor to call the legislature back into session into special session to address the problems that are now clear, have manifested themselves. And to ask our legislators to partner with us to ask the governor to call the legislature back into session, and also calling on the attorney general to release those model policies immediately rather than sometime next year, perhaps. So Council President, if there's another council member that is willing to support me, I think that's what we require to ask the city attorney's office to draft a resolution.
Council President, this is Councilmember Murphy, and I would support Councilmember Bader's suggestion.
Okay, this is David Hall with that request, and with a second, we will draft that resolution for you.
Thank you, and that's the end of my comments, Council President. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to Councilmember Moore.
Yes, this is so the crux of what we are experiencing in our society today. And one thing I notice is that when you live in Southwest Everett, there's no sun on your face. But if you live in Brenda or I'm sorry, I'm being levity, and Scott's neighborhood, they still have sun. So just a little humor, and it's probably not welcome, but there are so many sentiments expressed today. Oh, Liz, but you have people behind you we don't know. I think what I'm drawn to is how our political emotion in our community changes, and it just swings with the circumstances and public outcry. And I would always wish that our elected officials at state and federal levels have a greater opportunity to think about the actions and the legislations that they pass. But then you also recognize, and it's not just about getting reelected because so many of them are so passionate about what they do, but it's about coming together and creating a compromise in the last few moments on something that people disagree on that does not work. This is a perfect example of how when we knocked on doors 4 years ago, it was all about public safety. There was 100% support. And then the glaring inequities of our nation through George Floyd and other incidents flare up, and that we, I won't say knee jerk, but we respond in ways that it's kind of like in the classroom when you punish all kids to ensure that those who don't comply are also regulated. In other words, let me convert that. Our Everett Police Department, in the 12 years I've been on City Council, has been stellar, progressive. I've been proud. I am proud. I continue to be proud. And when you apply a one-size-fits-all and you do it in the last moment, there's significant flaws. And I just want to speak to our community. You are safe. You are protected by people that we've got the co-ed. We've got so many programs that we do not want to put people in jail. We want to renew their lives. We want to protect them. We can't tie people's hands. We can't assume that what you see on the media applies, and yet the way you vote influences legislatures. Dig deeper. I'm proud of our police department. I agree with Councilmember Bader's approach. Well, although unlikely, we got to make a statement, and I would encourage our administration to get other cities to join us. And it may not be a legislative session to call people back, but it does in a short session next year where it's housekeeping. This is a housekeeping item that must be met. It must be dealt with. So cheers to you for the presentation. And the reality that we face is something that I know the mayor and you, Chief, we're gonna wade through it. We're always gonna do the right thing, and I am thankful for that.
Thank you. And I agree with what has been said. I'm struck by, and I haven't read through all of the legislation specifically. Appreciate, Lacey, your summary of it. This legislative agenda comes from a place of wanting to address some perceived wrongs, and so I can totally understand the legislature, is coming from a place where they're, and and our society as a whole has seen that there have been wrongs. But I've been on City Council this is my 17th year, or maybe it's my 18th, and I have to say that those wrongs, by and large, have not been occurring in our community. And so I agree with Councilmember Moore. I used to tell my kids sometimes, a few bad actors make the teacher do something that everybody has to deal with, and everybody feels unfair. I think that the way that we are going to be policing now, as I understand it, may really make some of our community members concerned about our ability or inability, what we're doing and what we're not doing as a result of these. And so, Chief Templeman, what I would ask you is, as you kind of look at the caseload that the City of Everett Police Department deals with, can you help us understand what are some kind of top of mind typical calls that your officers would normally face that will be changed by this legislation, or the ones that would be changed the most, just to kind of give our community an understanding a little bit about what's happening, what's going to be happening on the grounds and at the doors and on those calls. Are there some instances that you deal with on a regular basis that you think, okay, this is an area where we're really going to have to change how we respond, and let us know what those are?
Sure, Council President Stonecipher, and I appreciate the fact that what I've heard here from a lot of the council members is that you all did catch my statement that we're still responding, right? But that the response may look different. And I can tell you, just in the last month, or maybe it's been 3 weeks, seems like more, but that we have had certain calls kind of rise to the top that have created the most confusion and adjustment in terms of how we respond. Those being response to assist designated crisis responders with taken individuals into custody, and the officers having to make their own independent evaluation as to whether or not there's an imminent threat at that particular moment. So that's been one particular call. Our assist to the fire department. You know, the fire department, they are not equipped nor necessarily trained, you know, to respond to combative patients. They do a great job. They have a lot of great de-escalation skills as well, but we do have calls where we go and assist and have traditionally assisted fire and EMS ahead of time just to make sure that the scene was safe for them to come in and enter. So those have been another a category of calls that we have been trying to work through and are still working through with Chief DeMarco, and I appreciate his partnership in that. And then the other category, and this one's a little bit more complicated, but that is those reasonable suspicion or Terry stop calls, you know, where officers are called into an area based on a suspicious call or some sort of a crime, but maybe we haven't been able to contact the victim yet or the reporting party. So we haven't been able to verify even yet that a crime has been committed, but maybe we see somebody in the area that matches that description or is in the area and they're the only person at 3 a.m. and we may ask them to stop and they don't really want to stop. Those are situations in which we're not authorizing our officers to use any level of force whatsoever to detain that individual unless we can establish probable cause first. So I would say, Council President Stonecipher, those 3 categories of calls right now seem to be the most common, and I see Lacey kind of nodding her head as well from what she's seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there will probably be others as they resolve. I agree with Council Member Tui that it would be nice for us to get briefed on this on kind of a regular basis, and maybe after you've lived with it for a couple of months, if you could let us know, you know, sort of what else is coming forward or as things evolve, because I think our community is going to see the response in some ways is going to feel to some members of our community like an inadequate response. And I think that's just the concern, that they feel like, hey, what is the Everett Police Department doing? Why aren't they taking care of this problem, you know, perceived problem? So I think that there's going to be, I'm glad to hear you're doing some communication on the website and elsewhere, because I think it's going to be important for people to understand what those new constraints are, and just how we're adapting. So thank you for that, Mayor Franklin. I'm sure you have something to weigh in on this, as you've been learning probably more about it than we have. We're drinking from the fire hose tonight.
Yeah, thank you. First, definitely a big thank you to Chief Templeman and Lacey and the entire team, our deputy chiefs. Hundreds of hours, as Lacey shared at the beginning, have gone into studying this. And our legal team and our police department is doing the best they can to analyze this, like departments all across the state. And the level of confusion is very high. And when there's that confusion and inconsistency in the interpretation of the laws, we have to be very cautious. And so I certainly support Chief Templeman's desire to be extra cautious with the team, to protect our public and to protect our officers and to protect the city from liability. I think what's concerning is there's been a lot of misinformation and statements like nothing is going to change, and that is not true. This will change our response. We are responding and we are doing the best we can with these new changes. And we will do everything we can to protect the public and protect both perpetrators and victims. But it does change how we respond, and our public needs to be aware of that. I asked Lacey to go over this tonight, and I gave her 20 minutes when she spent 2 hours with me just a couple weeks ago. So there is so much more. And this is, again, just 4 of the bills. So imagine more than a dozen that have all of these nuanced changes that impact operations and how we serve the community. That's a lot all at once. And so the public will witness some changes. There'll be a high level of frustration. And I fully expect that we will be blamed, that we are not doing X, Y, Z anymore. And so I just encourage all of us to have a lot of patience and understanding with our department as we navigate this. And if you have questions remaining as a council, we definitely look forward to continuing to update you. We will do that. But if you do want, we'll try to work on what helped me in the presentation that I received, which was much more detailed, and we didn't have adequate time in a council meeting, is really hearing those scenarios. When X happens, this used to happen, and now this is going to happen. And so that it gives us kind of that tangible idea of what is different. And so we'll try to work on how we can best share that information with you and the public, whether it's through that web portal or whatever. But of course, every situation is different. But appreciate all of the work that the team has put in. And honestly, I can't tell you how grateful I am for Chief Templeman's leadership. We are fortunate to have such a progressive police chief that embraces reform and that has been ahead of the curve for years on really moving our department forward, but and amazing department to support him. So really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Councilmember Murphy, you had your hand up.
I do, yes. Just one final comment, and Mayor and Chief, I know you share the concerns of most of us on the council with the ambiguity that's been created, and just you folks are living with it day to day. And I really appreciate Councilmember Bader's suggestion for a resolution, and would offer up in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that perhaps if we can agree on what we're requesting and the wording, that perhaps Mayor Franklin and Chief Templeman, you'd like to sign on as well, but we can work through the details later.
Sounds great. Well, that brings us to the end of this item. Thank you again, Chief Templeman and Lacey, for being here to help us understand these new changes, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you as things unfold. Move on to our next briefing agenda item. Item 16 is the city update on homelessness. This will be an update on the city's response to homelessness and our goals for working in partnership across the county. We have Julie Willie here tonight. Hi, Julie.
Good evening. I'm Julie Willie, Community Development Director, and I'm going to give an update on our response to some of the challenges related to homelessness that the city is currently facing. The mayor, her staff, and you, our council members, are contacted on a near daily basis about the impacts of reoccurring or new encampments, the concern of visible homelessness, and the impact to businesses and housed residents from individuals living on their blocks. An increase of unsheltered individuals over the past several years has been created by numerous factors, such as lack of affordable housing, the opioid crisis, lack of treatment and behavioral health services, and certainly the impacts of COVID-19 have only exacerbated those factors. There was no point in time count in 2021, but the 2020 PIT count showed that Everett had 300 unsheltered individuals, which represented about 43% of the county's unsheltered population. And the increase between 2019 and 2020 shows that the challenges in Everett are growing at a double the rate of the challenges countywide. From year to year, countywide, there was an increase of unsheltered residents of about 12%, whereas Everett experienced a 23.5% increase. And as you recall, we didn't have adequate shelter or services before the pandemic. Today, our numbers are even higher, as COVID-19 has brought additional chronically homeless individuals from throughout the region to Everett to seek the limited services that exist. Everett is seeing a new group of unsheltered people who are living on the streets and moving between locations. Cleanups that ensure sanitation and lessen the negative impacts to our businesses and residents do temporarily disrupt the street campers, but as they have no better place to move on to, they often return to the same camping space or relocate to a different area that they've stayed before and await the next cleanup. Our community and outreach team have been using a new tracking app since April, and they shared that they have engaged with 463 individuals in the past 4 months, which anecdotally compared to that 2020 PIT count number shows a 54% increase in the past year. As you know, our COET team is a co-responder unit that is comprised of law enforcement and social work professionals who are deeply trained in crisis response, de-escalation, and the knowledge of community resources. Throughout the years, COET has been imperative in helping the city understand the challenges people are facing while living without housing, in providing outreach and connections to services, as well as balancing those services by addressing any illegal behaviors that we can. COET is currently operating at full capacity for the first time since its inception, which now includes 4 officers, a police sergeant, and 3 social workers who respond to emergency calls, visit known encampment areas, and follow up with individuals who they have been working to assist for years. I'm going to pass it back over to Chief Templeman. He's going to share a little bit about COET's effect to some of the things he just shared, a little bit about our encampment response, and a little bit about some of our community partners.
Great. Thank you, Julie. And I promise this will be much more brief than my last presentation. So as Julie noted, our community outreach and enforcement team is finally at full staffing. I don't know for how long, but it is at this point, and so we're very, very pleased about that. And one of the things that we've noticed right off the bat is that by having a full contingent of officers and social workers and strong supervision, that we're able to really increase our response capability. And during National Night Out last week, and some of the visits that I made to some of the neighborhoods that have historically been impacted by visible homelessness in their communities, I did talk with a lot of residents, and granted there are some that are still being impacted, but some neighborhoods that are being impacted less. And I know that those are areas where our community outreach and enforcement team has been focusing their efforts on. So I am excited about that. I do want to take just a couple minutes to talk about COET's overall approach as it relates to complaints addressing our unsheltered population in Everett. And as many of you know, COET stands for Community Outreach and Enforcement. There's a reason why you have both O and E in COET, because they're both important. And there's a reason why the O is first, because our approach and our philosophy with our team has always been to conduct outreach first and provide services when we can and to those that are willing to accept those services. But we do realize that there is a certain segment of our population that we deal with where outreach and providing resources may not be the most effective means to address some of the issues that they're facing, at least to get them motivated to look at some of those outreach efforts. So we do and have, with our COET team, been conducting enforcement, and we will continue to conduct that enforcement. One of the things that we recognize as a team is that this is not, and I heard in the last presentation, one of the council members, I think it may have been more talking about a one-size-fits-all approach. Community outreach enforcement team and the scenarios and the situations that they respond to are unique. And so we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to that. We really have to work individually with these, with every one of the people that we come in contact with, and really tailor our response to the situation that they're currently facing. So I do want to provide just a high-level overview of how we are addressing some of these encampments that have been more visible in the last year than previously. And really, we run into 2 different scenarios. One is on private property and one's on public property. So private property encampments, we really work with property owners on that. Ultimately, it is their responsibility to address the encampment that may pop up on their property when we do get a complaint, but we work very collaboratively with property owners to address those, and we will provide additional assistance to them when it comes to assisting, as long as we're in compliance with current laws, with the removal of those individuals and the posting of property, private property, and conducting extra watches on those properties when a property owner may not be physically present to do that. The public property encampments obviously provide a little bit more of a challenge, but once again, it is still a collaborative approach that involves and spans many departments, including Julie's department, community development, public works, and the parks department quite often. and certainly other partners that are outside of the city as well. What we do when we get calls to these encampments, and this is really for the benefit of our community, is we do deploy to that location and assess the situation. So a lot of times there'll be individuals there that we may already, especially our co-ed officers and social workers, are already aware and familiar with them. But if not, as Julie pointed out, that number of 453, there have been many individuals that are not familiar faces to our team. And so we do really need to get to know what their individual needs are and what brings them to Everett, and what we can do to help assist getting them off the street if we can, and getting them into services. So we will make that contact. We will initially provide those outreach and service information. We will evaluate for criminal activity. So in some of these cases, there is criminal activity that's taking place, and we will address that. Doesn't always mean we're going to make an arrest. You know, if we can use that conduct in order to help leverage and get them into treatment and into services, then we may opt for that. I've mentioned this before many times to council. These are complex situations. This is not just your typical call of a disturbance, you know, between two people that aren't getting along and that officers can respond to and assist and resolve fairly easily. These are complex calls that involve a lot of work, a lot of resources, and a lot of staff time. Once we've done that, if that camp is there, we will transition then this over to Public Works, and Public Works assists quite a bit with the posting of some of these encampments and notification, and making sure that everybody there knows that we're going to be coming in and clean up, and we continue to engage. And that's what's really important, is that during this whole process, there's a continual engagement that's occurring. And then again, we will return, and most often we're seeing voluntary compliance with those that are there. But to Julie's point, a lot of times they may just move, right? Because we do have a lack of shelter space and housing. And so without adding that capacity, this is what we're going to continue to do. So that is a challenge, and that's what I kind of want to conclude on, just a couple of challenges, obviously being our shelter and housing shortage, treatment beds for mental health, and substance use disorder. We talked a little bit about 5476 in the last briefing, and that is the Blake decision, and I'm very hopeful and positive about the $80 million that's been designated and earmarked for more navigators and more resources and services. But the challenge there is that that system's not built yet. And so in the meantime, while that's being built, how are we going to manage these increasing calls for service and needs in our community? One of the challenges with the Blake and the decision is that there is no statewide database that tracks the referrals in other communities. We have on our own developed here in Snohomish County our own referral system. So we are able within Snohomish County, all the agencies here, to see if another agency, let's say Linwood, has referred an individual previously, but statewide we can't. So if we get an individual that comes in from Seattle, which we've had many, we'll have no way of knowing whether or not they've received any sort of referrals while they were in Seattle. And then I will say this, that under House Bill 1310, I know we've talked about this quite a bit, but I'm pleased to say that so far, you know, our team, there really has not been a direct impact on the work of this team right now as it relates to 1310, and meeting with them and talking with them about the various scenarios that they encounter. It certainly is possible that there may be instances where this team is deployed to a camp in a certain location where they may have to walk away, right? They may have to adjust their response, but thus far in the last 3 weeks, we really haven't seen that occur. And then as I conclude, I just want to talk about LEAD. You know, we do have some other partners, Snohomish County, you know, with their designated crisis responders. We still work and have a partnership, active partnership with that program. And certainly the LEAD program has filled in a gap, you know, that existed with our outreach specialists and social workers. And so we continue to work and mature that program, the law enforcement assisted diversion program that Everett and Linwood police departments are part of with Snohomish County. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Julie and allow her to conclude her briefing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, got a little echo. Sorry about that. So a shared COET and the city has strong partnerships with Snohomish County and agencies who are providing crisis intervention and navigation services. And we're fortunate to have many partners who work alongside the city and county efforts to implement best practices to address homelessness, helping individuals in need without causing harm to the greater city. We have a Hot Meals Coalition that is working to ensure meals are provided, and a strong faith partner group who comes together as Everett Faith in Action to continue to support positive outcomes for our city. More recently, we also have some organizations whose outreach is beginning to steer individuals away from important community-based services and are enabling them to remain living on our streets and by bringing them provisions. COET and some of our partners have shared that they regularly see items and food distributed to help, but that they're not utilized, and they quickly become trash, attract rats, and become hazard for those on the streets and an expense for our city to clean up. We're working on ways to remedy this. An important strategy moving forward will be to bring these various groups together to discuss best practices and stay very focused on those individuals who are living in Everett, to stay hyper locally focused, know each person on our street by name, and to develop ways for the community to help them one at a time, addressing each individual's very specific needs in order for them to recover from living on the streets. The situation in Everett, in some ways, is unique in our county, but not at all unique to what other cities are seeing across the county, the entire country, I'm sorry. Everett is the urban center, the largest city north of Seattle, and we are sadly seeing urban homelessness in our community. Mayor Franklin is in close discussions with Snohomish County and our neighboring jurisdictions regarding the crisis situation on our street and the need for more support to tackle these issues. The counties and the cities across the county will be important partners for us. We are requesting that resources be allocated, at least proportionate to the scale and scope of the challenges in Everett, to ensure we are able to handle the level of need we are dealing with. Smaller communities are not dealing with the same urban homeless challenges that we are seeing on our streets, and we simply need more solutions for addressing the chronic unsheltered population that we have today. It's very concerning for all of us to see this dramatic increase, but our team strongly believes we can address these challenges with courage, support, and partnership. In the next several months, we will bring strategies forward that are either city-sponsored, county-led, or from our faith and nonprofit partners to address the needs of chronically unsheltered individuals and to mitigate the negative impacts that it has on our residents and businesses. It's going to take hard work and strong will, and it won't happen overnight. We also need to increase our focus on education and communication around these issues as our residents, social service and faith providers, our businesses, and you, our elected leaders, need to deeply understand the complexities of the problem, support and advocate for bold changes, and support the allocation of resources to make a difference. Lastly, we know we need to stop the pipeline of homelessness and ensure that children in Everett grow up with a safe and secure place to sleep at night. Over the last several months, I've worked with partners on our homeless student task force on recommendations to ensure Everett children are safely housed and succeed in school. Our report is now final, and I know that the mayor looks forward to sharing recommendations of the task force, which will hopefully provide a roadmap for these prevention efforts. So at this point, both Chief and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We will go down the council roll to see who has questions, starting with Councilmember Murphy.
Thank you, Julie and Dan. I guess my question is kind of a practical question, and it has to do with some of the homeless encampments that I've seen on the public sidewalks. I think you distinguished, Dan, in your comments about what can and cannot be done on both private property as well as public property. And I guess as an example, I would use the encampment that I've seen over the last several months on the sidewalk area up at the Colby and 41st intersection. And I know several weeks ago there was signs posted by the resident there that they were willing to sell off their possessions for cash, which was obviously a sad state of affairs. But what is the situation specifically on those sidewalks? Are those sidewalks considered public? I'm assuming yes. But if I'm wrong, if it's private, then what can be done by the private property owners? Or if it is public, what services can be offered or are being offered to those people in those sorts of circumstances?
Council Member Murphy, the sidewalks, particularly the one that you've described, is public in that location, and many of the encampments that we're seeing right now are along public right-of-way. I am, before I attempt to even get into this, going to see whether or not Lacey is still on this call, because I know that Lacey, from a legal perspective, has an exact response to your question. Oh, good. You're still here.
I'm still here. And council member, can you repeat your question?
You bet. My question was really to do with the encampments that we've been seeing around Everett that are popping up on some of the sidewalks, which I guess in the example I provided was a public sidewalk, where the encampment is literally just 2 or 3 feet from, a busy street. And so there's, obviously safety concerns from that standpoint, as well as health concerns just from a sanitation standpoint. But what services can and are being provided, or alternatives to those residents of those sorts of encampments, I guess is my question.
Well, probably Julie would be able to speak better to the services that are being provided. I will tell you from the prosecutorial standpoint, enforcement on those encampments is highly fact dependent. So we do have the ability to enforce criminally a blocking of the sidewalk, but the sidewalk has to be largely blocked from the ability of being used. So for example, somebody who's lying kind of alongside the sidewalk wouldn't necessarily be in violation of that ordinance. So, and as you all are very well aware, the Martin versus City of Boise case certainly hindered our ability to enforce our unlawful camping ordinance. And that's from a criminal prosecution standpoint. So I saw Julie nodding her head, speaking about the outreach that's gone on at that and other encampments as well.
Absolutely. The outreach that's provided to our encampments is really extensive. And I think that the other thing that we want to always remember is that a lot of the individuals that are very chronically homeless have a mental health challenge. And right now, our community, our county is absent of mental health resources that are easily accessible, let alone trying to convince individuals that that's the next step for them. And I know, not to give any personal information, but the one individual that's living on 41st Street, or who has been on 41st Street, has a overabundance of items, but it's not an encampment with multiple people. It's one individual. And so our team has been working diligently to try and help him understand that a hotel room or a different location would be a better place, but some of his mental health challenges have made that really difficult to do. And so, that is shared that they have that experience with a lot of people that they meet on the streets. So not only do they have to follow the law, but they can't force individuals into treatment and into services. So it's a really challenging opportunity.
Thanks for both those answers, Lacey and Julie. I guess just the only follow-up I would have is, do we have capacity, any more capacity at the moment in the pallet shelter complex for people, or are we all full up now?
Yeah, the pallet community was full within 10 days. We've had one turnover already, so an additional person has gone in, but they are at capacity right now.
Okay.
And again, I don't, some individuals don't want to go to pallet too, so that's another, we might have an opportunity and invite them to go to pallet, but some don't take that opportunity.
Right. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Council Member Tui.
Yeah, I have just 2 things, and thank you, Julie, for that update. I know with COVID, the day feeding centers and the mission all reduced capacity, and I'm just curious, are they back at the normal capacity? Or are they still less than?
Our hot meals programs never really stopped and didn't shrink their capacity. They actually have been giving more meals all year long due to COVID. They changed their service model from having people come in and be served at tables and to being more of a walk by and be given a meal on the go. And certainly that's not necessarily a best practice. We've been working with them for years to try and lessen impact to community, lessen trash, really understanding the impacts of having services outside. But the reality of COVID has made it so, a lot of the volunteers are vulnerable. Some of them, many of them are older church, volunteers that have their own compromised immune system. So they've really created safety protocols to keep them safe. And, are those living on the streets also have compromised immune problems at times as well. So they've been really working to keep everybody safe. But we're going to try and re-engage in conversations with them so that we can bring people back inside. Certainly, when it gets colder, when it gets darker here, it will hopefully be a less of an impact to our community as well. But
I had one other question. With the protection for renters and homeowners for foreclosure and evictions, do we have a plan in place to help them?
Well, we don't exactly know what help is going to be needed, and we know that our county partners have the lion's share of the resources to support that. So I'll have to give you some more information when I have a little bit more information about that.
That'd be great, because I think that could be extremely impactful in our community. So
well, and the concern for that too isn't necessarily the individuals that are currently living on the streets. It's really our low-income families that are just teetering, or all of a sudden are going to have increase in their rent that they're not going to be able to afford. So that's very scary. Yeah.
Thank you for your update.
Thank you, Councilmember Vogely.
Thanks. It's now dark outside, and so I look like a ghost with the white. But it's been a little while since you had your last bit of monologue, and I just wanted to be like standing up. Yes, Julie. Yes, tell us how it is. So thank you for your information and letting us all know that A, there are some services, but B, there are such a lack of services and housing and all beds and availability and people to serve and all of these things, right? And your presentation about how we are dealing with and what the situation is on the streets is very much a part of like the eviction moratorium ending and coming up, and it's not just the low income folks that are going to be out and being desperate, it's middle income if we have any. And sadly, somebody that I know and love just recently said, oh, why don't you just go get a job? We have a lot to discuss about that particular comment, and where there may be jobs available, they're not really available because you can't leave your kids at home to go to work, and there's no childcare, and all these things. So there's definitely ways to write policy as a city council to create more affordable housing and abundant housing. And the caller from the very beginning of this meeting is building hopefully some market rate housing that is going to be beneficial to people who can pay market rate rents and or mortgages. But just having people know that if you don't want people living on the streets, there needs to be abundant, affordable housing for everybody in all shapes and sizes at all price points. And you know that, and I think we know that, but we have taken some steps to not implement these changes in the past. So thank you for laying it all out again. And I look forward to continuing to advocate for streamlined processes to get people housed. That is all.
Thank you. Councilmember Roberts.
Thanks, President Stonecipher. Julie, thanks for the update. Council Member Tui asked some questions that I wanted to ask. I think for me, I would be interested in your coming back to us sooner than later. So maybe this is a question for Council President Stonecipher. Once we get better information on the CARES Act allocations and better information on, at least even if it's preliminary information, on the COVID impact, meaning the issue of rental assistance and the issue of what the impacts are in our housing marketplace, particularly at the lower levels of the spectrum, of the economic spectrum. I would really love to hear what we think the best approach will be to find more resources for more housing. I mean, the bottom line here is we need more capacity. And so what those recommendations might look like from your perspective and how we might try to build that into appropriate asks, both at the federal and state level as well as locally. And I think that probably is consistent with the Rethink Housing work, which will be coming forward as well. So I guess I'm inviting you to come back, but it's not my job to invite you. I think it's my job to ask President Stonecipher if we can try to get that sort of on some kind of regular schedule. And I think it's consistent with what Councilmember Tui was asking as well. So I guess I'm asking that we keep this close hold as we go forward in time. Thanks.
When I might just also throw out that we talked often about the housing spectrum, and the housing action plan is really addressing kind of all areas of our need. And then we're going to need some additional strategies for our chronically homeless and for those that are impacting our streets. And so there'll be some different strategies that also will be brought forward.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Looking at this as an economic spectrum helps us understand that there are different strategies for different parts of that spectrum. And that's exactly right. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Bader.
Thanks, Council President Stonecipher. And thanks, Julie and Dan, for a great presentation. I think it's very helpful information. At least one question. It seems to me, Julie, from what I hear you saying and what I hear Dan saying, is we basically are offering help to anyone. The example of that guy on 41st Street to get him off the street is that we're offering help to people who are out there. Correct?
Yeah, and again, some individuals don't want help. And we also know we have a list of people that are ready for pallet and they're ready to move on, but we just know we don't have enough shelter, to get them in there, so it is that whole mixed bag of challenges that are currently being on our streets.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate all you guys do to offer help to everyone out there. And I don't know if we can do this. The mayor would know better, the best of any of us probably. But if we can use some of those ARP funds for more police or more pallet shelters. Sorry, it would be I think would be something I would strongly support doing. I think there's room in behind the gospel mission for a few more, and so I'm certainly advocate for that. I guess I'm also concerned about the unsafe nature of this public camping. I mean, not both to the residents who are there. I mean, I think as I've heard with the last month or so, there was a fire at one encampment underneath the power lines in Pinehurst, and I think some of our once or twice a year seems we have somebody running across the freeway that gets hit. My understanding is they've been living in those homeless encampments, but certainly, obviously, for others as well. I've seen open fires in some of these encampments under I-5, and I think we all heard about those situations. And I was wondering if this morning I saw some smoke, a big plume of smoke rising from the riverfront area, and wondering if that was an encampment with the fire that had gotten out of hand. I didn't have the time to reach out to administration to find out if that was the case. But I think just the unsafety of it, both for the residents and who live in these, who are public camping, and for those who aren't. So I mean, I think every effort to push people to and prod people to take the offers of help that are being given. And we all have heard from people, our residents, that they really, I think there's a sense of generosity amongst our residents, but on the other hand, they shouldn't have to put up with, I think, the petty crime and squalor that comes with these encampments. I think it's too much to ask our residents, and I think the level of aggravation out there is so high that I'm hearing. 2 years ago, I was hearing when I was at doorbelling, we don't want to be like Seattle. Now I'm hearing, I'm done, I'm moving, I've had it. I'm telling people not to come to Everett. And frankly, it's getting me to the point of suggesting, and I know legal wouldn't want to hear this, that we set up a challenge to Martin versus Boise to see if a new makeup on the U.S. Supreme Court would lead to a different outcome. And finally, I don't want to do it, but I think it's wrong to expect people who live near social services, as we heard at the beginning of the meeting, that the UCC church, or in my neighborhood, the Motel Express, where they're experiencing, a lot of impacts in their area because of the services that are provided out of those entities. And I don't want to do it, but I think if we don't have something that effectively gets rid of these public encampments that so disproportionately affect people who live near these public services, that I am ready to propose a few more discrete, 2-block no sit, no lie zones to diminish the impact on the residents who live near these entities that are offering social services, just because I don't think the people who live near them should have to disproportionately suffer the impact. So anyhow, thanks, mostly a speech and not questions, but I appreciate you letting me share my sentiments. And again, thanks for all the work you're doing in the information. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilmember Moore. Oops, you're muted.
I'm being sort of self-reflective, and I look to my senior council members, Roberts and Stonecipher, to recall that this is a common, and in fact, I look back to the days of my dad as mayor in previous years. There is no solution to homelessness. We just have to do the best we can each and every day. And the causes seem to shift. We used to call them hobos, they rode trains, they were vagabonds. And then as you walk around our community, you say, who is responsible? And most say, city council members, what are you going to do about it? And we have to say, we are facing a structural deficit. So whether it's the police presentation earlier or this conversation here, it all comes down to money. So how do we solve the problem? We're never going to solve the problem. In the old days, you just pushed them away. You took them on a bus and you took them someplace else. And so when we're facing our structural deficit, we as policymakers, and I'm speaking not to you as colleagues, but I'm speaking to the community, have to face, as Julie said, what policies make a difference. And then you face local political opinions. And I think of leaders locally who are now maybe on county council who came in and said, why are you criminalizing homelessness when what we tried to enact was an ordinance to keep people from panhandling on the corners for the safety of our public, for the safety of them, so that people don't stop. And we have internal opposition because we're so polarized that you don't trust the police with the ability to say the reason we would say don't hold cardboard on the corner isn't to deny them money, is to give us the mechanism to get them into some treatment program. Because as Julie said, we got lots of shelters, or we don't, but if we did, they don't want to come. And so we have diversion programs. We have diversion programs that probably are models. We have the COET program. Yet we face these people that come to the council and line up in numbers saying you're criminalizing homelessness if you don't let them hold cardboard on the corner. So I'm expressing after 12 years a little bit of disillusion for those who are so extreme and so polarized that you want to come in and create, because people just listen to you. And if you don't trust law enforcement and Dan Templeman and our police department to do the right thing, and you don't step up and just lay it down and come in and meet and try to find common solutions, is it about you getting reelected, or is it about trying to find a solution? Because it's not the role of city government to solve it all. It's just not the role, because we can't, because we don't have the money. We're trying to keep the parks open. We're trying to keep the government open, and we're trying to keep your potholes filled, and we're trying to keep the animal shelter. And I just get frustrated, and this is probably the reason I did not rerun for re-election, because it's the same reel. And until we unite as a community and stop blaming each other and start working together, and I won't name names, but we've got to do it, because it's an illusion. Every time you go out and knock on doors and you want to get reelected and you say, well, here's the answer. I'm convinced, because I've asked at every door, what's your answer? What's your answer? I talked to, there's not an answer to solve it. It will always be here. And we have to protect and create encampments and do unencampments. And I'm looking at my good friend Liz. There's not a great solution, but we have to advocate for our own views. But it can't be done with city dollars. We have to engage the community, and we have to think better about it. So sorry for the dissertation, but if we're sitting there thinking we're going to solve it, then we've got to have the guts, even those who are most vehemently against, what would I say? You're criminalizing homelessness. I despise that statement, because every time I voted in that direction, I was trying to solve homelessness. So that's my comments.
Thank you. And so I'll just try to keep it short. It's getting late, and I know everyone's probably tired. I appreciate, I think, I know that I've at least asked for this briefing. So Julie, thank you very much for coming to us tonight and giving us kind of an update on where we're at. But I guess what I just kind of find myself feeling like is I agree with everyone that, I mean, this is the issue that I hear about when I talk to our residents. I mean, this is it. If you go door to door right now, the only thing people care about is homelessness, and they're seeing it explode exponentially. And the COET program is great. I'm very proud of that program. I'm glad we've got it fully staffed. I think that that's wonderful. But I think we have to stop patting ourselves on the back for having a COET program, because unfortunately, the people at COET don't have what they need to take the next step when they're engaging with the homeless people that they're interacting with in our community. We don't have enough treatment programs. We don't have enough housing, whether it's temporary or permanent. We don't have a day shelter where people can go that is not, you know, our library or, you know, using the bathroom on the sidewalk out in front of our business community. We aren't giving the resources to this problem that need. And I, unfortunately, have been on council all this time. I've never even heard the plan. And like, what I really would love to know is, here are the groups of homeless. I understand we've got the recalcitrant that just really don't want. I get it. There's a group. How big is the group that's waiting for housing that we don't have to offer them? Who's waiting to get into treatment? I mean, we've got 453 people out there. That doesn't seem at this point like an unmanageable number. It honestly doesn't. 453 people, it's like less than a high school. And what we're doing right now, all the strategies, whether it's no sit-lie ordinances or moving encampments, we're just playing whack-a-mole. And so we've got this great COET team who's out engaging with people, and I know they've had a lot of successes. I don't want to take anything away from their successes, but it's not working. We still have a ton of homelessness in our community. What do we need? I'd love to know what the plan is, and I'll go camp out in the county's offices and start telling the policymakers over there, where they seem to have more money than we do, what we need. Whatever we're trying to accomplish, I don't know what it is. I don't know what the steps are. I don't know what the pieces are. And whatever it is, we're not making it happen. And so I just, as a policymaker, I want to know what's the 10-point plan, knowing that it's not going to catch everybody, but it's going to catch some of the people. And at this point, we just need to make progress because our homeless population is growing instead of shrinking. And 30 pallet shelters, even if we add another 20 out there, is just not enough. I mean, I just would love to know what the plan is. And maybe it needs to be something that's without resource constraints. What would we do if we were unconstrained by resources to house people in our community? So a lot of these people, I'm assuming, need kind of a low barrier type thing. I feel like the Claire's Place, for all the hell we took getting that thing through, has been an amazing success. I've heard 0 complaints from the neighborhood over there. It seems like it's full and dealing, if you go visit there, they'll, the people who work there will just tell you the most heartwarming stories about, people off the streets. And I know that's an answer for some, but there's got to be other solutions that we would want to implement. And I just haven't heard, in my time on council, what is the strategy? What's the 10-point strategy? The closest we came to it was the Streets Initiative Task Force. And that, unfortunately, had so many strategies that it was really hard to kind of figure out what need to happen first. So there's a lot of communities out there that are making progress on homelessness. Seattle's not one of them. I want to find out, what are those best practices? What's the plan? And, it's probably going to be like an 80-20. We can deal with 80% of the people, and then the 20% are just going to be our burden to deal with. And those are the ones where the no sit, no lie ordinance or whatever more punitive measures need to be taken against them to inspire them to do something, is maybe where we're at. But I'm just frustrated because I want to do something. I want to be helpful to this cause, but I don't feel like I can be. I see a lot of hands. I'm going to let Mayor Franklin say some words, and then I'll go back through the city council roll call so everyone can have another chance to make comments or ask questions. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, President Stonecipher. And I apologize, I've got a cat trying to interfere with my screen here, but this is obviously something that we are all very passionate about, and it is an incredibly complicated issue, which I guess, in response to you haven't seen a plan. There isn't an easy plan to solve homelessness. That is something that we and the county and the state of Washington and the entire country has been working on for some time. And I'm on a number of task force and mayor cohorts that work on these issues. And there isn't a community that has figured it out. There are communities that are doing aspects of it very well. And as we learn of those different aspects, we try to replicate them, bring those ideas, and see if we can find the funding to do it, which is how we formed COET, which is how we got the recommendations in the Streets Initiative Task Force, which is why we have Claire's Place, which is why we have pallet shelter. So those are all lessons learned of what's working in other parts of the country and how we can implement them. This, there's a number of comments that were made regarding other issues related to housing. And tonight's presentation was really just on chronic homelessness, visible chronic homelessness in the city of Everett. We have hidden homelessness. We have families that are doubled up. We have a whole slew of other issues, but we have visible chronic homelessness, I think, is what we get the most concerns about in our community. So I asked the team to really focus on that. I'm happy to, have the team share more on what happens when the eviction moratorium ends and what is our plan and how we're working with the county and all that. That's a whole nother group of individuals. But the people on the streets that are chronically homeless often have severe behavioral health challenges, and coupled with the new laws over the last couple of years, not just the ones enacted this year, but others, have made it harder and harder for us to enforce. And what the city has done historically is a balance between outreach and services and enforcement. And that balance is getting skewed because we're not able to enforce as much. And it's getting skewed at the same time where the population is growing. So we are having people for the first time, for years, as I was a service provider, I said, like all service providers, 80% of the people in the city of Everett are from this zip code or from close to this zip code. Today, that's not the case. Today, we're having individuals that are actually fleeing Seattle and coming north because they don't feel safe on the streets of Seattle. And there's services that have closed down in Skagit County or East Snohomish County or anywhere else in the county, and that have now come into Everett because we are the urban center and we have more services. And so the work that we are going to be doing in the most urgent level over the next few months, and that I have been doing with the county, is to articulate that with Snohomish County and to express the crisis that we have in Everett and the need for those resources. We have a once in a generation opportunity with ARP funds, both here in the city that are our own funds and at the county level, for a significant investment, which is what's been lacking for some time, is the resources to do something. We have some resources now that we could invest to expand treatment, to expand shelter. And for the population we're talking about on our streets right now, it's treatment, shelter. Those are necessary steps to get people housed and off the streets. So I will be working very closely with Julie for the next few months. I've cleared her plate of all other work so that her job is now, she's been tasked with doing our very best to address homelessness in the city. And I agree with you, Council President. I believe 450, this is a solvable. We'll never solve homelessness. We will always have individuals that experience homelessness, but we should be able to house 450 people in the city. And so we will work towards that goal with, as Julie shared, by really understanding each individual on our street, what their unique needs are, what they need in order to exit homelessness and get back on their feet. And we will only be able to be successful if we do it in partnership with our faith partners, our nonprofit partners, the county, and all of the jurisdictions around us. And I think we have some momentum around that. Honestly, as a former provider in this field, I think I've seen more momentum and solidarity around this one issue across the county than I've ever seen in my career. So I do believe we're at a really good point to address this. But it's not going to be easy, and it will take time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go back down the roll, starting with Councilmember Murphy, if you have any further questions or comments.
First of all, I really appreciate everyone's comments on this. It's obviously an important topic for all of us. I guess what I would suggest or ask that we consider is maybe doing a separate workshop type meeting on this topic in the next couple of months. I know we have a lot on our plate from a budget standpoint and a lot of different areas, but But I agree with you, Council President, that I think that for the council as policymakers to better understand what are all of the various levers that we can pull potentially with this once in a lifetime funding opportunity that should be coming. It's my understanding that the county has already received the first, I believe it's $80 million. The cash is in the door at the county, and the second wave will come next year, as I understand it. So while they are planning their disbursement of those funds, I think it would be good for us to simultaneously be getting ourselves up to speed better with Julie and the mayor and the rest of the staff on what are all the options, the levers that could be pulled, whether it's adding more pallet shelters, adding another Claire's Place, additional services from a mental health standpoint or whatever. So that's what I would suggest, is that we maybe devote a longer period, a 2 or 3 hour workshop to this topic in the next couple of months, if that's possible.
That sounds good. I'll work with administration to talk about when we can do that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Tui.
Yeah, I don't have any other questions. I think there was lots of great dialogue, and I do agree with Councilmember Murphy that it would be nice for us to be fresh earlier in the evening, and to be able to really spend some time talking through all this and the funding that's coming our way. So I would be in agreement with having a special meeting where we could devote to just this. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Vogely.
I've been waiting. Okay, something that I forgot earlier to Julie was, yay, hearing the homeless by name. You are doing that, and that is needed, not just the point in time, but actually knowing the people on the streets. And I have been sharing with just about every single person I possibly can, and that includes Chad over by the Boeing Painfield Snohomish County area that I wanted to move the Rucker camp to. And talking about doorbelling, Snohomish County tomorrow, other elected officials or wannabe elected officials in Snohomish County. This book called The Affordable City by Shane Phillips. I've been reading it. It is about policy, and it is not a let's fix everything. It just is this one little, this is all you got to do. We have to look at our community and what our special issues are so that we can have an affordable city. And it's all about policy making, which is exactly what we do. So I've been holding a book club, and if we're going to have a workshop, it might, here I go again, behoove all of us to read this book. I know that we couldn't get together except for in a public arena to discuss it, but I think it is a good starting point because we're the policymakers. That's all.
Thank you. Councilmember Roberts.
Well, thanks. This is a good discussion indeed, and I appreciate it. I agree that having an opportunity to get us together in a workshop setting really helps, and I would just support that. So I hope we can do that. I also hope when we do that we can tee up some directions and actions so that what comes of that is some action oriented. The other thing, just an observation, but a number of us, if not all of us, fought to some greater or lesser degree all of the issues associated with I'll call it the list of horribles that would come if we approved Claire's Place. And we heard those same kinds of concerns with other projects as well. And here we are with Claire's Place and Cocoon House and pallet shelters and special shelters in our community. And for the most part, we don't hear concerns about them. What we hear is concerns about folks who are unsheltered. So I'm hopeful that what we can do is follow the direction that I think the courts have given us in Martin v. Boise, build the shelters, build the housing. And I'm hopeful that we can get the resources, whether they're from the ARP funds or from other allocations. But I think we have to aggressively go seek the money because we clearly don't have it within our own budget. So I think it's time to put that front and center. And I don't say that as though we haven't already wanted to do that, but I think it's time to say, no, we need funds to build shelter. And there are two kinds of infrastructure. One of them is the physical infrastructure to house people. The other is the social infrastructure. And unless both are there, we are going to have some challenges. When both are there, I think the examples are pretty good that the system works pretty well. So I'm just hopeful that that's where we can go, and I look forward to more discussion. And thanks for the discussion tonight. And thanks to administration and Julie for your trying to bring us forward on this. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Bader.
Thanks. Great comments from everyone, at least my opinion, and I appreciate the discussion. I'd like to move forward, as you had suggested, Councilmember Stonecipher and others. But I do think the one thing we need to hold is that group that just will not accept shelter and will not accept help, because I think that's the group that is most aggravating our residents and giving us the biggest challenge in terms of how we minimize that impact on our residents and neighbors. So, but thanks everyone I appreciate all the comments and learned a lot tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Yes, and I think Councilmember Bader, that is the key of my earlier setting community expectations to align. Julie, I love everything that you're doing. Mayor, I agree with that. I think we're overly optimistic because it all amounts to resources. So we also need tougher public policy and constraints. Tougher public policy and constraints. Communities, I'd be interested in seeing communities that seem to diverge their homeless issues, seem to have tougher policy and constraints that drive people to seek another place that's a softer place to land. And when I talk to people, that's what they believe. If we are soft on those individuals that Councilmember Bader just mentioned, then we are a softer place to land. And they can be here. My wife and I walk around Green Lake every weekend, and right now it's a softer place to land. We have to recognize when we make this a softer place to land for those individuals who do not seek help, they will land here. And it's needs to be said, because Council President, when you talk about we just need resources, many people say, is it the role of a government when we are paying taxes? We need to seek policies that attract resources. Yes. Claire's Place, we invested money in. Most of what we're doing, we invested money in. We said no to a shelter by Sequoia High School for homeless students. Why did we say no to a shelter by Sequoia High School to house homeless Fountie? So we have to question ourselves and take tough decisions when we need tougher policies to make this an easy place to land. Then we're just either, I'm sorry, we always seek about public opinion and swaying to it. And this is the vocal majority. I'm just critical of the fact that if we set the expectation that we can solve this, I would say no, unless we can have tougher policies that create this to be a city that's a safe place to land and do the sorts of things that those do who have no interest whatsoever to be sheltered and live in one of these places we always do. So this is my oration tonight. It's a firm belief, and I hope we take a stronger stance on public policy to do that.
Can I just throw out one thing just as education is that these individuals aren't necessarily just saying, I don't want to do it. They actually have a lot of mental health challenges that maybe make it so they can't do it, or they have behavioral challenges and violent behavior. And they've tried programs, they've tried Claire's House, but now they're back out on the street because of their own behavior, because of their inability to make good decisions. So the complexity, right, of the problem, it's not just because they're saying, no, I don't want it. You know, some of them are just not capable of knowing what they want right now. So we've got a lot of extra work to do.
I agree with that, Julie, but there's the others that are the vagabonds and gypsies that are living the free life. You got to admit, there's that group there. So how do we get rid of them?
Okay, well, thank
Getting a little too honest here, bruh.
all for this good conversation. I'll work with administration to come up with a time that we can workshop some things. I think I've heard good feedback from everyone about what we would like to talk about. And so I'll like I said, I'll work with them. We'll figure out when we can bring this back, just to give us some more information and maybe some more education about, you know, kind of the different cohorts of people who are on our streets. I think that might be helpful, Julie, for you to help us understand what the groups are and, you know, what the relative size of them are. So that may be helpful, and what specific approach appeals to them. Because like, I mean, I agree with the mayor. I think 450 plus people that's manageable. That is a manageable size. And if we don't get our arms around it soon, we're going to lose track of it. And it's going to be, you know, 4,000 people, and that will be much harder for us to figure out. So that is all we have on our agenda tonight. So I would tell our public, if you'd like to provide a comment, you may do so by sending us an email at council@everettwa.gov. That comes to all council members. All comments received will become part of the public record. We have all the numbers that will be available on the city website to help you navigate to our next meeting. I don't think we're able to put those up tonight because of our technical difficulties. If you wish to participate by providing public comment at the meeting on August 18th, we ask you to call 425-616-3920. The conference ID is 144-600-565#. And if you call in advance of the meeting, that will be helpful. And with no further business and no executive session, we are now adjourned.